with me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. May we have a roll call?
Commissioner Duggan.
Here.
Commissioner Iacopone.
Here.
Commissioner Roof.
Here.
Vice Chair Bergman. And Chair Bradley.
Present. Thank you. Now we have public comment. Public comment is limited to items not on the agenda. The Commission may briefly respond to statements made or questions posed as allowed by the Brown Act, Government Code Section 54954.2. However, the Commission's general policy is to refer items to the staff for their attention or have the matter placed on a future Planning Commission agenda for a more comprehensive action or report. Is there any public comment? Yes. If you come up here to the front. Would you state your name?
Pardon me?
Would you state your name?
Yes, Barbara Williamson.
Thank you, Barbara.
I assume that the panel all lives in San Carlos, right? The committee.
Yes, by law.
I want to know how in the world that humongous building on Laurel Street between the Animal Dental Clinic and the locksmith ever got approved to be built. It's a monstrosity. It takes away from the street. How did that ever get approved to be built there? It's awful. Every time I walk past it, my blood pressure goes up 20 points. How did it get? I want to know how it got approved.
Do you want an answer? Would you like some feedback?
Pardon me?
Would you like some feedback on
Yes.
this? Okay.
Yes.
So first of all, no one on this panel was here when that was done, and
Where are you?
it was the commission before us. But my understanding is that it was shortly after the new zoning standards went in, and it was built to those standards. So there really wasn't a way to see the impact until basically it was built. That's my understanding.
Plans are there to be approved. They had to see it was a monstrous, ugly building to be put up there. You have plans, you have blueprints, you have all this, and you can't tell me that they said, go ahead and build that. It's awful. If I had money, I would tear it down. It's just terrible. And also, I live on Britain, and there's a house being remodeled on Britain 2 blocks before you get to Laurel. Way out of line. Very ultra-modern, does not blend in with the area, with the houses. How did that get approved to be built? Where is the line saying you cannot build such a thing in San Carlos? Are you really looking out for San Carlos?
Well, that's what these hearings have been for, is because there has been so much community concern over at least the size and massing of houses that it's been brought up for review, and we'll go to the city council, whatever the recommendations are from the...
So there's no answer how that got built. There's no answer, right?
Well,
and they're going to continue to build these monstrous buildings?
Well, that's what this whole committee is about. I mean, is to look at that and make recommendations, because the San Carlins that we've heard from really do not like the larger houses. And so we've had a committee that's been put together to review that. We've done a lot of community outreach, and this meeting is one of the last meetings that we will have before actually making recommendations to the city council. So it is something that has been very seriously considered, although it takes a long time to go through the process.
Well, I hope in the future you do not build those terrible, terrible buildings and approve these super ultra modern houses to be built. It's no longer San Carlos. We look like, I don't know what we look like now. I must say in your defense, I approve of the Transit Village. I think they did a good job with that. That looks presentable, looks nice. It's not humongous, it's not overbuilt. It's a nice, but this other stuff that's going on is terrible. I wish somebody would say, hey, we cannot do that to San Carlos. All you need is one person to say no, right? I mean, all right. For the future, please do not build anything.
Thank you for your comments. We do hear them. We don't want your blood pressure to go up, Barbara. And now we'll have the approval of the minutes from our last meeting.
Through the chair, I wanted to make just a brief announcement for the record. In your packet, there are there's one set of minutes that needs to be approved on the agenda, which are the meeting minutes of August 20th. And there has been a correction to those minutes, and the correct version is actually a separate copy that's on the dais, and there are changes shown in red line strikeout on pages 2 and 6. So I just wanted to bring the Commission's attention to that. Those were requested changes, I believe, by Commissioner Duggan. Thank you.
Are there any other changes noted? I will move to approve the minutes as amended.
I'll second that.
Commissioner Dugan,
Approved.
Commissioner Iacopone,
Approved.
Commissioner Roof,
Approved.
Vice Chair Bergman,
Yes.
and Chair Bradley.
Yes. Thank you. This meeting is another study session, the third one, and we'll hear from the presentation of the consultant. Thanks, David.
Just to be clear, through the chair, we're not voting on anything this evening, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Good evening, Chair and members of the Commission. I'm Al Savay. I'm the Community Development Director with the City of San Carlos, and I'm going to give you a brief presentation this evening with regard to staff's recommendations. And what I thought I would do is start with a little bit of the background and what we've heard and how we've reacted to what we've heard so far. We have Stefan Pellegrini with Opticos here this evening, and also Lisa Costa-Sanders and Lisa Porras to answer any questions of the Planning Commission or the public. Tonight is our third Planning Commission study session, and at our last meeting, you requested some additional information, and we provided that to you in your staff report, and we'll talk a little bit about that this evening as well. And just for the next slide, I'm going to back up just a little bit and start with what we heard from the Single Family House Advisory Committee. And when we started out, the charge from the City Council was to look at the size and scale and massing of single-family homes in reaction to some community members that were talking about how houses had gotten larger and the scale and massing of our homes in the community. And so the City Council put together the Single Family Housing Advisory Committee, and they looked at the standards that we currently have. And when they looked at our current standards and looked at what was being built, they noted that there was these key areas that they believed, if adjusted, would reduce the mass and scale of homes in the community. And these were things such as building height, setbacks, where you put the garage. A lot of times the concern that we were receiving is from homes that had a 2-car garage at the front of the house. And on smaller lots, on 40 and 50 foot wide lots, what we were seeing is that the garage dominated the ground floor, and the front door became an afterthought. Some of the concerns that they had is that maybe, and others have had, is that maybe the form-based approach that they were looking at doesn't go far enough in terms of dialing down the size and bulk of single-family homes. But they did talk about FAR a great deal. The SHAC believed that the way to reduce, the most effective way by consensus to reduce bulk and mass of the homes was to work on the physical characteristics of the house itself, to take the scale and the walls and the roof and push it all in, as opposed to using a number to do that. So on one hand, what we've heard is some of these recommendations are too prescriptive, they might be too complicated, and there's some preference for more simple controls like floor area ratio. On the other hand, some people think, hey, these are the SHAC came up with some pretty good ideas. However, they may not go far enough, and additional controls, and we've heard of floor area ratio, and also people have been mentioning daylight plane. Those things might be needed as well. This is an aerial photograph of San Carlos between Walnut and Elm Street. And one of the things that we planners like to do is when we tackle an issue, we like to go back to what the root of it is. And we usually start, if it's about scale or character of a particular area of a community, we'd like to go and first see, well, what's out there? What's happening on the ground? And so this photograph is a representation of a well-established neighborhood in our community. And as you can see in that photograph, the houses are all pretty close together, and that indicates a pretty small lot size. I'd say they're between 4,000 to 6,000 square feet max. And one of the things that we also see here is if you start to look at the shape of the homes as we look at some of the shape, and what you'll see is that there's a larger piece to many of these homes, and then smaller pieces that are attached to the home, like in this example. And in the form-based approach that the SHAC has taken, they talked about the main body size and wings. So the main body, form, and wings. And the main body is the main part of the house where most of the living is done. And then, as we've seen in our own community, historically, people have either added on wings. If you look over here, this is a relatively new house. I drive by just about every day. And they, redid the whole house in this main body, and then they decided to add a wing back here. And one of the other things that we see is a lot of detached garages at the rear of the structures. And in some of the older neighborhoods, we see a great deal of that in town. And another thing that people have commented on is that sometimes these garages could be dangerous with people backing out into the street and such. However, what we're seeing is that they've been used in our community for decades. And actually, if you look at it too, you'll note that there's opportunities to park lots of cars in here, particularly if you have guests. So the idea of the main body and the wings is actually something that is done in our community and has been done for many years. So this idea of form-based codes isn't really all that new, it may be new as a standard in our community or even our county, but if you look at the actual forms of what we're seeing in our own community, we'll note that the forms are actually here already. And many of these homes are of a very reasonable scale and fit well into the neighborhood. One of the other questions that I've had as well, does it really work from a floor plate standpoint or a floor plan standpoint? Can you really live in one of these form-based homes? And on the right-hand side, you see some studies that were done for the Single Family House Advisory Committee and the Commission. And what the shack started with is, well, if we're going to do this and we're going to start with a main body and we're going to try and squeeze the house down into the most practical, functional area, it should be a livable area. And they started talking about, well, what does that mean? So for a family of 4, they decided that a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house would be a reasonable place to start. So anything, if you're going to dictate the scale or mass of the main body, it has to be a functional for a family in San Carlos. And so that's what this study shows, is that you'd have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath on the second floor and your living area on the ground floor, much like these homes here. And then maybe if you want some additional area, you can add a wing to it. So what we heard, and so the local architects, we talked to the local architects, and they were very concerned at the beginning, and we had a number of meetings with the local architects and talked to them in great detail about how this would all fit together, how would it work. And they had a number of suggestions and recommendations that you see here on the screen. I'm not going to go through all of them, but what we found after looking at them and talking to the architects is that, yes, you could accommodate just about all their suggestions. There may be one that we may be, suggesting a different number on, but we can accommodate all of their suggestions in any, let's say, any design-based or form-based recommendation. What we've heard from the public is there's a desire for floor area ratio limits, and we'll talk about what that means. Also, a desire for a thing called the daylight plane. People, since we began the process, other ideas and concerns have been discussed, like the idea of privacy, light, and air, and views and things like that. And some believe that the idea of a daylight plane might help that. There's concerns over 2-story homes where you have a single-story home in a well-established neighborhood and how that looks. And then again, protection of privacy and views, and more public noticing for the RDRC meetings, our Residential Design Review Committee meetings. We did go back and look at some other neighboring jurisdictions in our county to see what their floor area ratios look like, and a number of other communities do use it. And so what we've presented here is for benchmarking purposes. When we looked at these other communities, we looked at their codes and we talked to the city planners to verify this information. And so there may be other ways to interpret these numbers, but we didn't want to be too drastic in our recommendations for FAR, and we did include our own city, San Carlos, in these calculations and comparisons. Other interpretations of these numbers may include a lower FAR, but a different interpretation would not change staff's recommendation to you this evening for your sliding scale option or option number 3, which is an FAR option. Wouldn't change that. And if the Planning Commission wants to have a more restrictive or a less restrictive FAR, that's certainly up for your consideration. One of the other things that came up at the Planning Commission is a concern about topography and how these standards would affect houses or properties that had a steep slope to them in the hillside areas of our community. And we've always recognized that these are inherently different. These properties are difficult, much more difficult to build on. They're very steep. It costs a lot of money to build, to dig out the hillside, to put up big walls and things like that. So our community put in place a thing called a hillside overlay zone that gives special zoning for these areas. The areas on this map, the areas in blue are the slopes in excess of 20%, and that's 19% is the, little over 19% is the cutoff when you're in that hillside overlay zone. And so what we're seeing, it's interesting that the topography of our community kind of splits generally in half, and this area is the flatter areas, and then this area has more steep lots as you go up the hills toward 280. And so that shows that there is a different sort of, there are a number of different parcels with these sloping areas. And so we've applied different standards for these areas. And we're not suggesting with the SHAC recommendations that they should be applied to these areas. They shouldn't. It's a different area. However, in order to reduce the bulk and mass on those hillside homes, there are a couple of recommendations that we would suggest adding to the hillside overlay district. We'll talk about that. Then we talked about, well, how many lots or in our community are small or of a smaller size, and what about this idea of maybe we should look at our community and do neighborhood zoning, like where certain people or certain characteristics of parts of our community are homogeneous, and so maybe we should come up with some specific standards for neighborhoods. When we did this study, what we found is that the smaller lots, the vast majority of these smaller lots are less than 60 feet. And while the White Oaks area of our community tends to have the majority of the lots that are less than 50 feet, really, we see that these 50-foot lots are spread throughout the community. And even as with the 51 to 60 foot wide, the green lots that you see here. So if we were to take the approach of trying to divide our community into neighborhoods, it would be very complicated to do that and would be very difficult to implement a strategy to and work with it on a daily basis. Thus, it would be our recommendation that we still move forward with a property-based approach, a single property based on your widths approach, as opposed to a neighborhood approach. One of the other concerns was, well, what happens up in the hills? And what we see is above Alameda de las Pulgas is where you start to get these parcels that are in excess of 61 feet in width. So the larger parcels tend to be in areas where you have greater slopes, and that's the hillside overlay zone. So we do have a good separation there in terms of dividing up the community into different areas based on their physical characteristics. So in response to some of the things that we've heard and the commission has noted and we've heard from the community, we are presenting you with 3 different options. And these options are, option 1 would be the SHAC recommendation, including the architect's request, and one additional twist to that would be an additional 9-foot second floor setback. As you may recall with the SHAC approach, what they were saying is that the main building mass could be 2 stories, and you could move that 2-story mass up to the side property line. Now, it has to be a condensed 2 stories, but still, it would be only 5 feet from the property line for a certain distance. And people thought, hey, wait a minute, that's a little too much. So what we're suggesting is that second floor be moved in 9 feet instead of 5 feet. And so that's different than what you've seen before. So it's more significant setback for the upper floor. Option number 2 would be an FAR sliding scale. And we'll go into detail about that, but basically it's the more square footage you want, the more rigorous a process you would need to go through. And then number 3 is a more simple, straightforward approach where you would have just a floor area ratio and a lot coverage maximum, and then work with what we've got today. So in terms of option one, the SHAC recommendations, on the left-hand side, you'll see the building setbacks. Those are the controls that they use. And the controls that they suggested do have what we call resultant reductions. So based on today's standards, if you apply their standards, you would have a reduction in floor area ratio of about 20%, 22% reduction in lot coverage, and an 18% reduction in an overall square footage. So it does result in numerical changes to our homes. In terms of sliding scale recommendations, we did some, I'm going to talk about some of the research that informed this suggestion. And what we've seen, looking back 10 years at almost 100 applications for homes, is that the majority are less than a 0.5 FAR and lot coverage less than 40%. However, I think what we have seen in the last maybe 3-4 years is that we are seeing an uptick in the square footage of the homes that are getting built. So you have a maximum FAR in San Carlos at its current up to 0.92, and generally peninsula cities allow for a median of closer to 0.59. And we have a lot of lots, maybe 63%, that are less than 60 feet wide. So in comparison to other communities, and this was noted at SHAC and discussed in a great deal, is that we're a little different. The character of San Carlos is different in that Burlingame, San Mateo, Menlo Park, some of those communities have more larger lots to contend with. And then just as a point of reference, the current threshold for Residential Design Review Committee review of a new home is an FAR of 0.4. Option two is the sliding scale, and essentially the primary principle of this is that the less square footage that you want, you go through an easier process. More square footage means more requirements as you ratchet it up, and more review. So let's look at that. These are the three different sliding scale options, and it's really based upon the house size that you want. We started at a 0.50 FAR, and the reason we went to a 40% lot coverage is because of our historical average. If the commission thinks that that should be larger or smaller, again, any of these numbers could be changed. But at a 0.50, that would be processed by the city staff, and it would use our current standards for zoning. If you want more, 0.51 to 0.59, you would have to go through the residential design review. You would use the current standards. However, we would add some additional thresholds. We would increase the rear yard setback and push that rear yard forward 20 feet on the first floor, and currently it's 15, and then 25 on the second. So that really starts to open up the backyard. Reduce the maximum garage width within 15 feet of the front facade to 40% of the facade on lots over 60% in width. Earlier I mentioned that what we were noticing is the garages became dominant and added to that feel of, when you look at a house, the mass on the front. So that's what this is about. And then changes to maximum height for the eave and the second floor to push down the upper floor and make it look lower. Desired house size of 0.6 to 0.7 requires RDRC, some of these other standards that we saw above, and then also changes off-street parking to 1 in the carport or in the garage and 1 in the driveway. And then it says you do have to apply the main body and wing content as suggested by SHAC as a requirement, as opposed to a guideline. And option 3 is very straightforward. Hey, let's retain what we have. However, add a 0.5 maximum FAR for all lots, and then establish a 40% maximum for lot coverage. We talked about daylight plane, and a lot of people are interested in this concept of daylight plane. What we see on the left-hand side of the screen is we have a daylight plane in our community without regulating it. The way that we created our daylight plane is we set in that second floor 9 feet on both sides. And for the average daylight plane that you see in most communities, or many communities, it would fit within that. With the proposed shack recommendations and that additional 9 feet, and that's where I talked about, we added that, so that this box area was the former shack recommendation, this gray area, and now we're suggesting, well, if you did go that way, then we would set that in, and then you would conform again to that daylight plane idea. And we can talk more about these. Now, this isn't recommended by staff, but it's something that people have discussed. In the hillside recommendations, we are suggesting just a couple of changes. One of the things that we were seeing in the hillsides with these slopes is that people were putting in basements, and then the part of the basement that you saw got real tall. It was generally it was about 6 feet. What we're seeing is, let's dig it into the hillside a little more, lower it, and thus you would see less of the home, and it would look less like a 3-story house. And then establish a maximum wall height at 16 feet for 1 story and 25 feet for a 2-story home, and we didn't have that before. And again, that compacts the roof form down a little bit to make the house look smaller. So tonight we're asking for some direction, and what we'd like to do, get your direction to proceed with one of the options, or you could certainly mix and match if you like. But we are looking for some direction, and what we would do once we got that direction is we would formulate a draft ordinance for your review at a public hearing. And then we are looking for confirmation of some of the recommended changes to the hillside overlay recommendations. And that concludes my presentation, and we're available to answer any questions. Thank you.
I have one comment, or would ask you to go into more detail on the daylight plane. We had one gentleman in here a couple times that talked about his loss of sunlight, and my understanding in talking with the city is that is because of how our zoning allows for less setbacks at the end, at the rear of the house. And I would just like that explained a little bit better, because I think that might play into recommendations.
Well, what we're going to do is have Stefan look at that and talk about daylight plane. I mean, if there's other, I guess the question is there going to be other questions that maybe we could gather up from the commission and have Stefan walk you through some of the other technical issues like daylight plane. We can do it either way, but if there's going to be several, maybe we could have Stefan get up there and go through some of these.
Well, sort of as a complement to Shannon's comment, I'd like to understand the benefits of not having a daylight plane, or the impact of not having a daylight plane in terms of the design elements that would then be allowed.
Okay. Other technical type questions?
Yeah, I'd be interested to hear the thinking behind the, you called it the rollback from 50% lot coverage to 40. What would one notice about the change? What would that result in?
With regard to lot coverage?
Yeah, you have lot coverage. In your third proposal, you would recommend it going from 50 to 40. So just a little more of the thinking behind that.
Okay. Any other technical?
I'm sorry, we're trying to create a
Gather
full
them up.
list.
Yeah, I mean, we could do it that way, or we could go one at a time, whatever you guys want to do. I just thought it might be nice for Stefan to get up and kind of stay there for a while and go through a few things, but maybe we give you time to percolate some more questions, and we'll start with a couple. How about that? We'll start with, I'll start with the lot coverage, and then Stefan, if you could talk about daylight plane, and we'll find that slide for you here. I will give you the remote. Here we go. Went right to it. So in terms of the lot coverage, the reason that we looked at that going from 50% to 40% was just to go back to what it was before the change was made in our zoning code in 2011. We had a 40% and it went to 50%. The intent wasn't to kind of spread the first floor out. It was, I think at the time, it was to be more flexible because we had an economic downturn at the time and a number of other issues. And also looking at the historical average of the homes that have been constructed over the last 10 years, we note that the average is about 40%. So we were trying to take those 2 points and merge it. Now, I can say that greater lot coverage may allow the house to spread out more on the first floor, which may, deflate the second floor a little bit. So that's the comment on that. Daylight plane.
Sure. Thank you, Al. And again, Stefan Pellegrini, principal from Opticos Design. Good evening, Chair Bradley, Vice Chair Bergman, members of the Planning Commission. A little bit more information on daylight plane. And I'm going to talk first about daylight plane, how it would apply to a side yard setback, and then if I may, I'm going to try to circle back to your question, which I believe is actually about rear yard setbacks. We started to talk about this a little bit. When daylight planes appear in ordinances, their standards vary, but they typically define an envelope that is a trapezoid that's measured from the side property line up toward the center of the lot, generally at a 45-degree angle. And these daylight plane standards basically say that the envelope of the house needs to fit underneath that trapezoid. And as Al mentioned, what we have in San Carlos today in the existing standards is there's not a clear mention of a daylight plane, but the fact that the second floor has a 9-foot setback as opposed to a 5-foot setback, which is imposed at the first floor, generally is causing the house or forcing the house to sort of fit into that trapezoid. So when we analyzed what daylight plane standards were doing in other communities, we sort of took a smattering based on some of the peer cities, and this is sort of what we looked at. Generally it's 45 degrees. Generally it's between 10 and 20 feet measured at the side property line, and there are sort of other factors which make it difficult to compare apples to apples. And I think we mentioned, for example, Palo Alto imposes a very low daylight plane at the side property line, but they also allow additional height in the middle, greater than sort of what other communities may do. So one of the things I think that we've been concerned about is that the term daylight plane is a bit of a misnomer in that the availability of sunlight in this sort of three-dimensional slot that the daylight plane creates is very dependent on the orientation of your house. In that if you actually were sort of purely on if your house was and your neighbor's house were purely built on a north-south axis, the amount of sun that would sort of enter into the daylight plane would be much greater than, for say, if your house actually was built on an east-west axis. And so the forms that the zoning promotes do not in and of themselves set sort of a minimum amount of sun or light to reach the ground plane between you and your neighbor's house. So we sort of want to be sort of mindful of that. And I think the other thing I think to remember is that houses do tend to loom over neighbors' properties, but the number one thing that's actually creating shadows in neighborhoods that are of this scale are actually trees and landscaping. They actually have a much, they are typically the sort of the tallest things and sort of the broadest things in the landscape, and they actually have the ability to cast shadows and affect how you sort of would think about sort of a daylight plane or the slot that actually would be left in between houses. So we're sort of mindful of that. The other thing that we sort of want to think about, that we were, at least in terms of discussion with the shack, was that we knew that shaving away the second floor in every single case starts to present certain massing solutions in terms of architecture. And so we had just questioned, well, should it always be that way, or should we be giving architects and designers additional flexibility that doesn't result in that reduction of the mass at the second floor and that sort of step back or sort of wedding cake form that we talked about? Right now, the existing standards allow a percentage of your house to encroach, and it's typically about 30%, which translates to about 20 feet. You can do a two-story mass that is all the way to the 5-foot setback. The way that the shack and discussions had gone is that that allotment would sort of come out of how you actually dealt with the massing that would go into a wing. So if you had to set your main body back from the side, the two-story mass in the wing that we had generally started to max out around 18 feet would be allowed to actually go within that. And that's sort of the result that you see in terms of the massing of the houses and sort of where they start to compete with the daylight plane. So Al already went over the diagram sort of at the top. At the far left, that's the zoning envelope that the existing RS6 standards produce. In the middle, you can see what the proposed shack recommendations would produce, and the two gray wings that you see on either side of that are the form of those 18-foot wide wings that would be allowed to go all the way to the 5-foot setback. And of course, those could be 1-story or 2-story. So as today, what we typically get is a slot that is 10 feet wide between buildings on the first floor and 18 feet wide between buildings on the second floor. What this would actually generate is a larger setback, at least on one side of the property. But if you actually chose to put your house in the middle, the relationship of the sort of 2-story mass to your neighbor would more or less be the same to what you have today. But you can see that we actually are generally increasing the side yard setback than what the existing R6 standards impose.
So if the area which we are currently in the rear allowing to be a 5-foot setback versus the 9-foot setback, if we were to make that a 9-foot setback as well and just not allow the 5-foot setback in the rear or the house, the extra 20 feet of the house, would that resolve any portion of the problems that or complaints that we are hearing, or would it not?
Yeah, we do. And let's see if I can actually flip back to this, because that sort of parlays back to your initial comment, Vice Chair Bergman, about the impact on rear yards.
Yeah.
So I'm going to start with this one. And this shows the existing zoning envelope and the minimum rear yard setback of 15. And this shows the proposed setback, which is informed by two factors. One is a increased minimum setback of 20 at the first floor and 25 at the second floor. And the second is the maximum depth of the main body, which is generally set at 45 feet. And so what this does, and I'm going to actually go back to this diagram that Al showed, is that not everywhere, but on many blocks, the size of rear yards is generally consistent. And it is generally much greater than that 15-foot minimum setback. So it's fairly common and for rear yards in San Carlos to generally be 25 to 30 feet in depth, but everybody is sitting on an untapped piece of their zoning envelope, which means that if your neighbor chooses to build to the full extent of their rear setback within the limits of the control, which today is the 50% lot coverage, there is room for conflict there, because suddenly where your rear yard was shared by adjacent rear yards and adjacent properties, you'll have a rear yard addition that is suddenly looking onto someone's backyard. So the idea behind increasing the minimum setback by at least 5 at the ground floor and by 10 on the second floor, number one, and two, to limit the amount of addition space that can go into that space between the main body and the rear yard to the dimension of a rear wing, is to start to sort of limit some of those potential conflicts that we see.
So, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, but that's except with regard to the new garage standard, which can be right on a 5-foot setback. Trying to reconcile the thought of this is a much more liberal or much more, airy setback for your neighbor, but then encouraging people to put a garage at a 5-foot setback seems very counter to that thought.
That is correct, and I appreciate that comment. One thing to keep in mind is that the provision to put the garage at the rear setback is not a new standard. It is actually built into the existing RS6 zoning. And I don't know why that was done, but I think what I would suspect is that the insertion of a garage in that rear yard zone has a different impact on privacy than the insertion of sort of an actual house. There is another angle to that when we start to think about that garage as a place where you could put an accessory dwelling unit or something similar. And so those things actually do start to raise. But one of the intentions of what the SHAC recommendations do was that it seemed to make sense to carry that provision forward to allow the garage to go all the way back to essentially the rear of the property, particularly because it does not necessarily present the same privacy issues that building a house to the rear of the property would suggest.
And I think historically, what we've seen is that, in the massing of the house, one of the main things, again, the main problems we have is these big garages at the front. And so one of the things that SHAC looked at is, what if we took that out? What if we removed that box out? What happens? Well, the house gets smaller. It's like a balloon, right? You take air out of the balloon. And we're already doing that. We're already putting our garages at the rear throughout the community, and people have been doing it for decades and kind of living that way. So let's codify that. Let's say and make some standards around that, maybe more robust standards around that. So that's the intent, is to take that sort of not livable area and put it somewhere else, and thus the main body of the house looks smaller.
And Al, are we treating garages any differently, or do they count as lot coverage and floor area ratio space?
They count as floor area ratio space. Now, I can't recall if they count as lot coverage too. They do? Yes, they do.
Even when detached and on the rear line? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So this slide sort of is part of a larger discussion. We didn't have a chance to share these with you last time, but just thinking about the rear yard setback, this sort of is a strategy. Today you have 15. There is a provision for detached garages today that actually can shift them back all the way to the rear property line. What we're proposing is 20 and 25 at the first and second floor respectively. The analysis that we show here is that today you can build a building up to 85 feet from the front property line back into the back of your lot, and these standards would actually shift that from 85 to 65. So you can think about that as the maximum depth of a building would be reduced, and that back portion is going to be limited to a rear wing as opposed to the full extent of the zoning envelope moving to the back setback. And our analysis was that, again, that we felt that this was a cause of conflict, and I think what we've heard from many of the residents in terms of the impact of additions on neighboring properties, this was designed or thought of as a way that could start to mitigate that particular issue and make sure that buildings break down in scale as they transition to the rear yard.
So, but is there another way to get at the same issue, right? I mean, I personally have a hard time with taking away people's backyards. And so can you get the same effect by by making the setback 9 feet period on the sides of the house instead of 9 feet, except for the last 20 feet, and then it's 5 feet? Will you get the same result?
Yeah.
And plus the reduction of the lot size from 50 to 40%, would that solve the problem as well?
Yeah, I mean, there is a consideration. I think what I'm hearing you ask is, could the side yard setback be consistently applied at 9 feet?
Mm-hmm. Would that make a difference on the daylight plane?
And yes, it would.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what our measurement would be is that understanding that the majority of lots are 60 feet or less in width, and over 50% of lots are actually 50 feet or less in width. That is a pretty significant reduction in buildable area if that setback is imposed on both sides. So what we are suggesting is that you still would be allowed to build up to a 5-foot side yard setback. The SHAC recommendation said that you could, in theory, shift that all the way over to one side of the setback on the property. And then what Al has described tonight is that if there is a concern about the height and mass of that 2-story form at the side setback, that an additional 9-foot setback at the second floor could be imposed. And if I can flip back to this, and I can sort of show that graphically what we're talking about.
You know, Stefan, I was thinking maybe we should show some of the models.
And I think those are those in your presentation?
I can do that, because I think what you're saying, it might be easier to see.
Before you do that, Al,
yeah, sure.
I'll just point to the bottom diagram here. If you look at the two houses, one in the middle and one on the right, and you see the portion of the building that actually is sitting above the trapezoid. So
let me stop for a moment, if you don't mind, because I'm the way I'm looking at this is just my own personal feeling. Is I am personally leaning towards basically having a FAR and a lot lot coverage. So what I'm trying to get at here by asking these questions is whether we can improve the likelihood of, the less likelihood of affecting people's light plane or whatever we'll give it a new name, right? By imposing new standards for FAR and lot coverage and possibly setback or something like that. I don't know if that's the right answer or not, and I'd frankly like the architects to weigh in on that, but that's where I'm going, but I want to go ahead and let you do your...
So, and I think if I can quickly respond to that, the setback standards as proposed do emulate a daylight plane as it has historically been applied in San Carlos.
So it would not positively impact the light. It would still cause light problems if it is imposed today the way that it's. I'm sorry, I'm getting all confused.
Wouldn't change anything.
It wouldn't change anything.
We'd still have this issue.
Well, I will say,
is that true if you do the 9-foot second story setback? Because I want
to actually, Al, excuse me, but if we could go back to the side setback analysis and maybe stick with that, because I think what Vice Chair Bergman is actually, we were talking about the rear yard, but you're referring back to the side yard now.
My understanding, and the gentleman that's been up here before, and that's why it keeps coming to my mind, right, is that there was a lot of the light was removed from the rear of his property.
Yes.
Right? And so what I'm trying to get at is, without going through the form, basically, or the shack recommendations, and going to a simpler FAR and lot coverage, if there's a way to still help homeowners in the same situation.
So I would say my response to that is that FAR and lot coverage in and of themselves will not prevent that specific problem from occurring again. FAR and lot coverage could be used in conjunction with other setback standards, which would help mitigate that. The standards that were discussed with the shack were one solution that were determined as being effective to solve that problem.
Right, and then that was why I brought up the 9-foot setback along the rear of the house, whether that would make a difference.
So if I could just clarify what you're saying. What we heard from the gentleman, I think, is there was a gentleman that spoke a couple of times to the Planning Commission. What he said is he had an addition that he did, and I don't know if it was a single-story or a two-story house that he had, but let's say it's a one-story house. This is a one-story house. This is the existing build-out that we have today on a 45-foot wide lot. And what it shows is that this gray box is maxed out, and this is the 30 feet that we're talking, or 30% that we're talking about at 2 stories, and it shows over here. This is the same thing. So let's say this guy put the addition right here. What he's saying is that I think that this was built next door. And so now all the light that was coming from before is now not getting into this day room or whatever they added there, and they lost their light. So this is the existing condition. The only way that you would improve that is to say you can't have this 30% anymore. You'd have to notch out that 30% piece there. Now, architects put it on the back sometimes, or they put it on the front, depending on what the floor plan needs and that kind of thing. But that's what I think this gentleman was talking about.
Right.
And I think in the rear, I think another good example of what the shack is saying is, in the rear, people are saying light and air and shadows. Well, this shows that, again, you see a single-story house here, and then this 2-story building far closer to the property line. Thus, more shadow coming into this area of the house if you have a master bedroom back here or something. Then the second story cuts off another 10 feet of the yard as you see it. You're going to see it. It's going to cut off light and air into your backyard. Shack said move that away. Be more restrictive with your setbacks in order to provide more light and air in the future. So those are, I think, and the one thing about this 30% I can say is that it benefits people who want to do additions most, I think. Because if you have an existing condition where you're 5 feet away from your property line and you want to add on to your house over here, then you don't have to build like a new special wall there, like that costs a lot of money to do that. It costs more money, I think, and John Stewart will correct me if I'm wrong, but to do this movement in as opposed to go straight up structurally, right? So it gives a benefit to people who have an old existing house and they want to go straight up, and maybe their floor plan is good. There's a square bedroom there. That's what that 30% is recognizing. So the only way I think you're going to fix this problem with this would be to eliminate that.
Yeah, and I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but I wanted to at least explore that and get people, again, basically, hopefully get the architects to weigh in on it. Because I don't, like I said, I don't know the right answer, but I don't know if it's a solvable problem or if that's something we live with. But I just wanted to explore those avenues.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of a similar concern, not really daylight plane as much, but just solving the problem at hand. I mean, the problem we've been charged with is we have these large, homes that are looming over their neighbors, and we don't like that very much. So this set of standard, the more time I've thought through it and wrestled with it, it just seems to me that defining a relatively smaller main body, and then in particular reducing the lot coverage, aren't we sort of forcing people now to go up? It seems to require that people push their mass higher, which strikes me as, you know, kind of a opposite of what we're trying to accomplish. If someone, I'm not sure if anyone's aware of any concerns about a house that got too big in one story, but I think the houses we've been mostly concerned with have been kind of the two-story large presence types house.
So I think that's a very good comment, Commissioner Dugan. Our analysis suggests that, as I mentioned, that as Al mentioned earlier in the presentation, that the SHAC recommendations in and of themselves, they result in a reduction in maximum house size of about 20%. And that's sort of generally, when we sort of look at all the conditions and sort of average them out, we're looking at houses that are about 20% smaller. And that's dropping the FAR, the results in FAR, to around 0.7, but it is get a little bit bigger. And I think what we would see there is that we are not restricting the size of the ground floor floor plate to a point where a decision would be made to go up when folks otherwise are not making that decision today. And the exception is on the smallest of lots where we understood that the SHAC wanted us to look at ways that we could actually enable one-story houses to get larger on the first floor without going to second floor. And so one of the incentives that was discussed last time was to give those particular conditions a larger build out of the ground floor so they wouldn't have to go up. But our analysis otherwise suggests that the second floor, or the sort of square footage, does not substantially get dropped below the range of what's being proposed today until you start dialing that FAR number down further. And that the imposition of an additional FAR would be I think the situation where we'd start to see further reductions in the zoning envelope in order to have houses that sort of met the standards.
So I'm sorry, you're sort of saying that without an FAR, we are going to probably see larger second floor development?
No, what I'm trying to say is that the main body and wing standards present a zoning envelope which we believe is still large enough at one story to accommodate many of the sort of one-story programs that we're seeing, and not force what would have been a one-story program today into a two-story program in order to sort of meet those requirements. What it does seem to do is that when you kind of get closer to 0.7 in results in FAR, which as we can show you, is a small percentage of the existing proposals, it actually forces you into a more compact footprint, which will force those houses to sort of go into a compact two-story footprint. But those are houses, I think, that when we see the applications today, they are big two-story houses. And so the result of imposing these standards would be that they would be smaller two-story houses. So there is a reduction in that zoning envelope, I think, that we would see. But the main body and wing envelope is, I would say, is still somewhat generous, particularly if you should have enough zoning envelope. If you have a reasonably sized one-story house that you're proposing, they would not force you to go up a second floor to recoup lost square footage necessarily, if that makes any sense.
So can you just keep on that thread and imagine a couple of the recommendations that are here being combined, which would be the large, an FAR, let's just use the 0.59 as a placeholder for now, in addition to the SHAC recommendation, and also not constraining the lot coverage to therefore squish all of that mass up, but allow it to spread out. Is that a compatible world? Like, can those things live together and come up with more incentive for one story and also give creativity and not encroaching on your neighbors?
Yeah, I think two things to respond to that, and that's a very good question. If we think about the SHAC recommendations as generally a 20% reduction in house size, if we added a FAR of 0.7 and went with some of the other things that the architects actually had recommended, we're looking at sort of an additional 5% reduction, or sort of a 25% reduction from what is allowed today. If we did that and imposed a sort of a median 0.59 FAR, it's about a 35% reduction in zoning envelope. The idea behind the third option that Al presented, the sort of sliding scale idea, is that you would be procedurally incentivized to propose smaller houses. And part of that would be about a streamlined review process that could avoid the RDRC. But part of it actually would be avoiding additional standards that would be imposed that would force you to put your building into a more compact two-story envelope in order to get greater square footage. So the idea behind this, what the sliding scale proposes, is that if you are under the initial threshold, which was presented as 0.5, that you could benefit from the existing standards, which means you could build a one-story addition, for example, up to the 15-foot rear yard setback in the back, perhaps, and you would not be restricted from doing that, and you essentially would be rewarded to do a one-story house that actually might have a larger, take up more of the zoning envelope, but be limited to one story, because you are under the FAR cap. If you sought additional FAR, you would, in theory, be subject to additional standards which would restrict your setbacks and force you into a more compact footprint. It would allow you to do a lot, you could get up to potentially 0.7 FAR, do a larger two-story house, but in order to do that, that house would actually have to be further away from its neighbors than a house if you were following that sort of tier one review.
I think also to add to that, if you did go to a less restrictive lot coverage, you might get more spreading on the first floor. So I think it would be okay to go from 40% to say 50%, or just leave it the way it is today. So I think you would get some benefit, or you would have some more incentivizing for that if you're considering that.
Yeah, thank you. And maybe, Stefan, if you could just say again, you did some quick math, which is great. At the idea that was floated by staff of 0.59, can you say again what your view is, the reduction in allowable house size?
Sure.
One more time?
It's generally about 35%.
Versus today?
Yes.
Okay. And then how would those compare with the other? So versus today is sort of interesting. It's equally important in the context of the other communities. Yeah. What would that do versus the houses? I guess it would, we're saying the data says it's about on par at a 59% FAR, including San Carlos.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to sort of think about, is that there are a lot of ways to sort of skin this calculation. There are also a lot of communities on the peninsula that have a lot of different stuff going on. So, looking at these as peers was sort of one way to think about that. 0.59 is getting you sort of very close to what you have if you look at this chart generally in communities like San Mateo and Burlingame. It is far less than what's at least right now allowed in communities like Redwood City. But I think it is important to remember, as far as we can understand, is that San Carlos is an anomaly in that it has a greater proportion of smaller lots than these other communities have. And so it is much easier to do a house of comparable square footage size if you have more lot square footage and FAR is your restricting factor in these other communities than it would be in San Carlos. So it seems to make sense that an FAR imposed in San Carlos would take keep that in mind, that the lots here are generally smaller than what you have in the peer cities.
So could we interpret that by looking at the 5,000, 6,000 rows in this table? Again, when I look at these, as you point out, Redwood City appears to be, leaving San Carlos out, an anomaly compared with 0.62, 0.57 Burlingame, 0.5 to 0.56 Menlo Park, kind of that range, yeah? So you're saying that we have more houses in that band than the other cities, was the point you were making.
That's correct, yes.
And again, if you leave out San Carlos, I'm not sure what the median or average home size is, but it'd be on the order of 3,000 square foot on a 5,000 square foot, just because that's 60%, 0.59.
Yeah, and if you can bring this one up, and the other one, I think that helps summarize the conditions in San Carlos. Just generally, you can sort of get a snapshot here. I think it's at number 36 there, Al. So on the left is essentially what you can do with the 50% lot coverage and no FAR control. And then these are sort of those three tiers, the 20% reduction using the shack recommendation, and that's generally the size of houses that are proposed. The reason why we presented a range is because where you put the garage on the property has a big factor in how much square footage you can get. If we capped the FAR at 0.7, you would start to see smaller second floors on the largest of houses. And if you cap the FAR at 0.59, you can see what that does to sort of the total square footages.
And then can you say what is the consequence of that? Because, to the eye, that doesn't look bad. So.
Yeah, no, I think what it would, this is an opinion. I think what it actually would produce is houses that generally have a larger ground floor and a more compact second floor. The ground floor square footage would generally be greater than the upper story square footage. The other thing I think to keep in mind is this. Let's see if we can find this here. The other useful piece of data, this is sort of a breakdown of the numbers that Al presented. This is based on almost 100 applications in the past 10 years in San Carlos. The vast majority are actually coming in under an existing FAR of 0.5 and a lot coverage of less than 40%. And you can see that the 0.6 and 0.7 thresholds are about 23% and 7% respectively. And this started to sort of get us thinking about that idea that, well, as you do swing bigger, maybe you could continue to sort of allow these, provided that there are more restrictions and a more restrictive review process. And that is also something that other cities have. They tend to have some sort of exception. They say, well, this is the largest house that you can do, but then here's an exception that you can go through to actually get something larger than that. So, we believe that the 0.59 would allow the majority of proposals, as they have historically been proposed, it wouldn't create a cap that would limit the majority of those from actually occurring. But it would be less than the largest houses that actually have been proposed historically in the last 10 years.
Thank you.
Another significant area of concern that I haven't heard addressed in any of this is what's the thinking on how remodels will be treated under this new standard?
So that's a very good question. And today, the short answer is that they would be treated in much the way that they are treated today. So if parts of the existing building are in a non-conforming condition, those can remain as long as 50% of those walls are actually maintained. So there are provisions today that allow existing buildings to expand, and if they can retain things on their property that are not to current standard, as long as they don't change more than 50% of that, they are allowed to have those existing walls and spaces to continue. So an example might be if a house has an existing side yard setback of 3 feet instead of 5, they can be allowed to, they don't have to rebuild that whole wall unless they touch more than 50% of it. And the thought is that if we imposed additional main body and wing standards, they would start to apply in much the same way. Or if you actually had a new garage setback standard, for example, it would apply in much the same way. You could keep what you have unless you want to shift more than 50% of it. And then you actually would be required to bring that up into conformity. And that follows sort of the tradition of what we have today. I do want to make one more point there, which is that there are provisions right now which allow some flexibility in how things can be measured. There is a provision for what are called waivers, where you can go through an administrative process to get some relief on setbacks and other things if you are having trouble conforming. And there is an administrative process for that that actually would continue under these new standards. And if you are really in a hardship, a unique hardship situation, there is that is where you would ask for a variance, and that exists today and would continue to exist under the new standards.
So just so I understand it, many houses in our community already exceed the main body standard in kind of their main footprint. So that basically means all remodels would have to be a wing in that case?
No, it means that where the main body would be imposed is if you choose to change 50% of the walls of your house, 50% or more of the walls of your house. So, let's say a house had a footprint of 35 by 60, and the main body dimension was 32 by 45. They would not be forced to change that box, the 35 by 60 box, until they've made a decision to alter more than 50% of those walls.
Right, but that's what I was saying, I think, is if they then wanted to have an addition, it would have to be under a wing, right? I mean,
yes.
So their main
yes.
body's not conforming, they don't have to change it.
Yeah.
So if they do want to add, they can, but it would be a wing out to the setback.
That would be the easiest way to build an addition, would to be as a wing that would come off of that main body, and that's the way that we would expect staff to interpret the standards for a house addition like that.
Stefan, have you considered what would be a hardship sort of variance? What would...
Well, traditionally variances are imposed in situations that are unique. If you have something on your parcel that is not allowing you to conform to the standards, and that it's something that's unique to your property and otherwise wouldn't be subject to sort of everyone. And that could be, I don't know sort of the history of sort of how variances have been applied in the city, but I think they would follow the same tradition. So the waivers process, I think, is a great way to think about flexibility in zoning standards, and that is something that is already institutionalized in the code.
Through the chair, in the cases where we have considered variances have been in situations where there's an extreme amount of topography on a site, and applying the standards really presents a very tiny envelope. So in order to have a building program similar to what other homes are allowed, we've allowed deviations from the code in that kind of a circumstance. That's one that comes to mind. But they're pretty rare in San Carlos, variances, but there is an avenue if such a case could arise, and we consult with the applicant and discuss the likelihood of being able to support such.
Because most of our very narrow lots are in the flat area.
Yeah, so the architects have asked for some waivers or some adjustability in the shack codes, and we said, yeah, we could build those in. It's very common for cities to say, okay, if you want a 10%, if you want to go into that setback 10%, you have to prove that you have to do it that way, or you really need it. So it's very common for cities to do that, and it can be done.
Any other questions at this point from the commission?
My only final question is, when I think about my neighbors that have done remodels, what their principal objective seems to have been was to push out the back and create more of a great room out of one of these, 1960 floor plans. And when I think through this main body and wing, that provides enough livable space is what I keep hearing, but is that really what someone wants? I mean, it seems like our community wants these great rooms that really then open up to a backyard, and I have a hard time picturing an 18-foot wing really accomplishing that, and just wanted to get a reaction and thought to that.
That definitely was, that's a very good comment. That's definitely something that was discussed at length during the shack process. And what I understand is that there is a breed of single-story houses in San Carlos that are very difficult to add a second story to because of the design of the foundation, and that there are common floor plans which see just those, they see the great room addition on the back. And so the way that we responded to that was to allow houses that are on parcels of less than a certain width to be allowed to do a full build out to the rear setback, to not be subject to the rear wing standards, to allow that one-story addition to actually take place. The thing I think to sort of think about too is that, so that was sort of on lots, I believe, that were sort of 49 feet or less. And then there sort of was a second thing to think about, is that the main body depth of 45 not everybody will have already built out to that. So if you have an existing floor plan, let's say that's 32 feet deep or 36 feet deep, that means that you could do an 8-foot addition across the entire back of your house to that setback before you needed to actually go down to a smaller wing mass. And so it was difficult to say that that the wing that every addition would just end up being a wing, because there would be unused zoning envelope on many houses that could take advantage of that full build out of the remaining main body envelope.
And I'm sorry, is that part of the proposal now, that the narrow lots aren't subject to wing? I don't.
Yeah, that was not in the packet here, but it was discussed during the last study session, and as part of a group of provisions that were seen as being advantageous to folks that had certain conditions. And that was one that lots less than, I think, 49 feet in width would be allowed the full build out to the extent of the rear setback.
Okay, so that is currently contemplated under this option
yes.
1 here. Okay.
Any more? If not, we'll proceed with hearing from the public. And number one first is Bill Harkola. Would you come up front, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
And we're going to limit our talks to 2 minutes. You can go over a little bit. I'll do that at that point.
Thank you. Chair Bailey, Vice Chair Bergman, Commissioners, Thank you. Thank you for your service. And this is the first time, and I've gone to maybe all of them, all these, and we're getting to the meat of this. And I just wanted to say thank you. The remodeling, the second-story massing. This is all about second-story massing. And I appreciate the hard work that's been put into these options. A lot of numbers. God only knows. It sort of rattles my mind trying to work through it this fast. And fuel for thought on that. It's complex. But simplifying this, I think the third option, to me, that's where I'm going on it, but with one exception. I think we need to push down and enlarge what can be on the first floor. Reduce what's potentially on the second floor by setting a floor area ratio more in line to 50% and then maintaining the existing lot area coverage. And the rest of the details, I think, are great discussion. More discussion might be needed for that because really the devil is in the details. But having these simple set standards will set guidelines. Simple. Not getting into RDRC review without having more teeth to them. They were very nice to me. They approved what I have to live next door to, which has robbed my light and privacy. And they apologized to me, but they couldn't do anything for me. It's just clear and simple as that. So I just want to say thank you. We're going in the right direction, and I really appreciate it. And just keep pushing on those same comments, because I think that's what you really have to have answers for. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Bill. Next, David Crabb.
Chair Bradley and members of the commission. I'm Dave Crabb. I'm an architect. And I sent you a letter. I sent it late, so you may not have had a chance to read it. It would have my letterhead on it. I don't know if you guys had a chance to read it, but I will read it off a little bit so that the audience hears what it's all about. A lot of the things you talked about are actually in my thinking. One thing, I agree that the option 3 is the approach to take. I would put the maximum FAR at 0.53 because I would exclude San Carlos and that average that they did, which I think the folks over there agree with. And then I would delete the lot coverage requirement and just put the FAR in. That would encourage more one-story proposals. Just keep it within the setbacks. And then your second stories can go up. But it doesn't limit you to do a full two-story building if you want to, a small building on the whole site. So if you got, let's say, just 0.5 FAR for a 5,000 square foot lot, it's 2,500 square foot of building. You can put 1,200 square feet on the first floor, 1,200 on the second floor, or you can put 2,000 on the first floor and 1 bedroom or 2 bedrooms on the second floor. Gives you more flexibility. I maintain the existing setback requirements, but I would include the daylight plane. And the reason I do that is because you've seen the diagrams and the comment about that 30% that comes over to the 5 feet. It's also a problem with the wings concept, which I think the folks that are concerned about this are concerned about the fact that you can do a wing within 5 feet that's 2-story high. So if you have the daylight plane, that eliminates that possibility. So I would do that. I like the increasing the rear setbacks to whatever is comfortable. And I like the concepts they have about relocating the garage, rethinking the garage, either putting it in the back or making it 1 car covered and 1 car open, or 2 cars covered in a tandem type of situation. All of that makes sense. 1 car covered makes a lot of sense if you're going to include it in the FAR, because then it gives you more space to do your housing, your living space. I also had one other thought is if we did an FAR on the site, and let's say that we say that includes the house and the garage, How about if we say you can do as many covered porches as you want on the site as long as they meet the setback requirements and not include it in the FAR? We like porches. We want to see porches. Put porches on the front, put porches on the back. Right now, they are included in the FAR, and that kind of takes away your living space, and I think that's not a good thing. So that's my basic letter. I do have a question. I don't think it's brought up yet, and I just haven't think about myself. How does this all apply to second units, ADUs? I don't know, like we talked about, well, garages, if you have two-car garage, separate two-car garage, it's ideal to put an ABU, a second unit on the second floor. Well, except when your garage is 5 feet from the rear setback lines, that's not what we're looking for. And so I think you ought to start considering how ADUs come into this situation. And if you're thinking of trying to encourage extra units or additional units, does that mean that you would increase the FAR for those additional units to make that work? We want more additional units, actually, quite frankly. Little 600 square foot granny units or whatever in a house. So that's that. But I think the big thing, I heard contradictions in the discussion, especially that discussion about the daylight plane and the fact that 1/3 comes through and they show the diagram of it throwing shadows. Then they forgot to mention that their wing concept does the same damn thing. That wing can be anywhere and it can be within 5 feet. It's the same as your situation you have now. So that wing thing doesn't really help you out much. And I feel there's a lot of flexibility if you just keep the FAR in there, and some of these other comments I have. Hope you can get a chance to look at my letter if you haven't already. And as an architect, I think I can work within that. I've worked within the old plan situation, and I thought come up with a pretty nice little house. And so that's my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Next, we have Christian Bichia. And Brent, too, yes.
So, let's see. We do have some slides. I think those are being brought up.
And while we're doing that, I think we can go ahead and, for those of you who've heard us speak at past meetings, Good Growth San Carlos, we're a San Carlos citizens-based group that's been, sorry. Speak closer into the mic. Citizens-based group here in San Carlos. We're, the last couple of years, been pretty passionate about the issue of home sizes here. And so in looking at the latest proposal from the city, if you want to go ahead and click through, we got a couple of upfront slides. I think we can probably just, So the problem that we're trying to solve, as we've referenced before, is really the impact in terms of home sizes on neighbors' privacy, light, and air. So not just the cityscape view or the street view, as we've referenced it before, but also the neighbor's view, right? And then, of course, as well as keeping the character and coherence of the city of good living. So the options that have been discussed tonight, which there are 3 of them that are currently being proposed, we want to walk through and talk about our analysis and point of view as it relates to each of these. They've been covered, so I won't enumerate them again. But I think the overall question is, how do we decide in terms of the effectiveness of a given solution and the problem that we're trying to solve in terms of oversized homes on the impact on neighbors specifically. In terms of next door. And so I think, really there's a few tenets that we should consider, and that includes clarity and usability in terms of how easy it is to apply the standards, how easy can owners determine potentially what they can and can't build. So that's been referenced before by some of the architects in past meetings. When they have a new client who comes in, they'd really like, back of the napkin type of view pretty quickly in terms of what they can and can't build without having to go through a lot of process and incur cost along the way. And then lastly, we've heard a lot of the folks who have been before the RDRC in the past in terms of having objective standards, because the neighborhood compatibility guidelines that are set out today have left some ambiguity, whereas like Bill Harcola mentioned earlier, where the RDRC said, we're sorry, but we just can't do anything to help you, right? So we do think objective standards as it relates to whatever is ultimately decided on is important in terms of providing the tools for the RDRC and for the planning staff to be able to utilize. Christian, you want to talk a little bit about our analysis?
So if we accept the notion that looking at whether or not the standards solve the problem, so that's the effectiveness, and secondly, are they really usable by professionals, by all stakeholders in the process, this is a really netted out view of pros and cons. We just haven't had the time, both because the packet just came out Thursday night and we don't have, it's holiday weekend and don't have a lot of time to analyze, and secondly, we're asked to take 2 minutes to comment on something which clearly is complex, and we've heard from the city for the past hour and a half on. So long story short, if you look at the current shack, it allows FARs actually up to 78%. So do we think that solves the problem? No. Of house size and the impact on neighbors. Usability, they're complex to understand, and a lot of people have raised those issues. The sliding scale also allows very large homes up to 70%, which again we feel like is way out of line with our estimation of the median FAR in comparable cities is 47 to 56%. So well above it. And it's complex. We've got 3 levels, and you're asking us to rely on a review process that historically has not had teeth. So I'd feel very nervous about saying we're going to use review to make sure bad things don't happen. Thirdly, FAR and lot area coverage allows up to 59. This is, in our view, because it's the simplest and it gets closest to actually real reductions. We think this is the best option, but we also believe that the FAR limit should be 50%. I take real issue with many of the numbers the city has put up. I feel like they're misleading. In this case, if you calculate the median FAR and you exclude San Carlos from the data, we know that San Carlos has a FAR about twice as large as most other cities on the peninsula. If you exclude San Carlos from the data, the median you get is 47 to 56%. You only come up with, I don't know why it's backward and says 59 and then 53, but you only get up to 53 and 59% as a median if you include San Carlos. And including San Carlos in a data set against which you're comparing San Carlos makes no sense whatsoever. The other thing I'd point out is the median, average, and FAR numbers up there all also include San Carlos. So I think, to me this feels like misleading with statistics. To sanity check what a 70 to 78 or even a 60% FAR looks like, this is a house that is one of the key players in triggering this whole initiative, why people got up in arms about large homes in San Carlos. On the left is what used to be there. On the right is what is there now. 3,356 square feet on a 5,400 square foot lot. This was in my neighborhood, and it was 2.9 times as dense as every other home in the neighborhood in terms of the FAR ratio. It had minimum setbacks on all sides, and what you're looking at there is 62% FAR. So I look at that and I think, a 59% FAR, I think, is not solving the problem. So we think we're supporting a simple approach, 50-50. We think FAR and lot area coverage, potentially with daylight plane too, but those 2 essential elements. If there were a 50% limit on the FAR, and then why not maintain lot area coverage at 50%? It gives people the flexibility to build what they want on the ground floor, and we know that 2-story homes are the major issue. And it's also, it should say, the least impact on neighbors and less expensive to build. I think that's the main things. I guess I want to close with, I continue to chafe a little bit in my seat as I hear Shack recommended this, Shack recommended that. Because, again, I'd like to advise people, it was a single family home advisory committee. We made no decisions. We were presented with the form-based option as pretty much the only option to consider, and we're asked to say whether we liked the elements that went into it. So it wasn't as if we began this and said, well, what are the different ways we can solve these problems? We could use a FAR, we could use form-based, we could use something else. So I think these are, and if this is the SHAC's recommendation, where is the SHAC in this process? I'm the only member of this body that's been showing up at these meetings. So if it's their recommendations, why aren't they here explaining them? So, and I'd like to lastly debunk this notion of resultant reductions. It's theoretical and not practical. And I picked up this, letter from Michael Campbell at the back. And he says, FAR values, while much reduced, still seem very high, 63 to 78%, especially when compared to other mid-peninsula cities. Because only using setbacks, lot coverage, and house form restrictions, the results yield no practical limits on house sizes. I think the city's own data in the packet on page 4 here says that, let's see, it actually says that 20 out of 95 homes are over 40% lot coverage, which means that 30% of the homes that people have built in the last 10 years would have had to go up to a second story to get the square footage they wanted. So that's one thing. And secondly, if you look at, how many homes were over 70% FAR, it's 7 out of 95, so 8%. So putting a FAR limit in place that allows 69 to 78% floor area ratio, I think gets us nowhere. It's kind of like saying, we've doubled your taxes one year, and then you come back later and say, oh, we've reduced your 200% taxes by a third. Isn't that nice? It's meaningless. So I just think, God bless the architects that are coming here and speaking up, because it's not just residents, and I think they give some credence to what residents have been saying for 2 years now. And I really think it's time for the city and the planning staff to listen to the residents and get in line. And we're getting closer. We're very happy to see the notion of a FAR as an option on the table. That was something that it was fighting tooth and nail to get that to even be considered as a possibility. And it's sensible and it's simple. So thank you for your service to the city. Sorry if I get a little worked up, but we've been engaged with this for a long time now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. A couple more. Next is Lucia Sanchez.
Hi. I have to say, compared to last time when I was extremely discouraged, I am really glad to see that there's been some integrating of concerns in these proposals. I'm not great at keeping all these numbers and all these concepts together, but one thing that really did strike me when Stefan talked about, and I think Christian just made reference to it, that this may present a backing down on the size of house that is possible, but not really a backing down on the size of house that thus far has been made. And we're not living with theoretical houses. We're living with real big houses that are already being built. So that's my concern. When I heard that, I started thinking, gosh, even if this is better than what's allowable today, we're not even doing what's allowable today for the most part, and it's terrible. So anyway, that's all that I think. I don't know what the terminology is, whether it's FAR or whatever. I think they need to be smaller than what has been recommended thus far. So thank you.
Thank you. Now, Mr. John Stewart.
Members of the commission, thank you for all your hard work on this. I really like option number 3 like everybody else does. It's so simple. It's something that we're familiar with and we know that it works. That diagram with the 30% where the portion was close to the 5-foot setback, it was always shown in the rear, and I think that's misleading. I think, Shannon, you might have thought it had to be in the rear,
Yeah.
where that thing could slide up and down.
Okay.
So I think that part of that is something that the RDRC needs to look at, those kind of issues. And I know you're looking at putting a professional architect on that committee, which I think is a great idea. The ADU over the garage, the state law says you have to allow ADUs over a garage, and if you have the garage 5 feet away from the rear, and I think it's 3 feet away from the side, that's going to be a big issue. We designed one project like that. It never got built, but the daylight plane, every community has a different way of determining where does that daylight plane start, because a lot of times there's grade changes, and you take the front setback and the back setback, and then you average those two, and that's the beginning of the daylight plane. And it gets very complicated where if you just say push it in 9 feet like you're suggesting, that makes it pretty simple. You don't have to go through a lot of calculations to do that.
Does that severely limit the architectural choices to do that?
It kind of does, because you end up with a flat wall.
Okay.
I think a lot of it is if you ask to show the neighbors' windows and so on, and then we'd show our windows and you don't have a window directly facing into somebody else's window, that would be a really good thing to add. And then the other thing is that we always try to put bathrooms and things like that facing the side and have bedrooms face the front and the back. So you minimize, you have a high window or an obscure glass window or something like that, so the privacy issue kind of goes away. I think additions are still a problem because it's not going to meet any of those main body size, the garage, and a lot of other issues like that. Let's see, solar is going to be a big thing in 2020. Every house in California has to have solar on it. So if the roof is all cut up with these wings and things, it really makes it hard to put solar on. In Redwood City, they don't have any FAR either. They're like San Carlos, so that might have skewed some of the numbers also. But they're going to go to floor area ratio also, so that's going to happen. That's pretty much it. I really appreciate the staff, proposing option number 3, because I mean that's a big concession on their part. I know how much work you put into option 1 and option 2, and I really appreciate the ability for you to offer that as an option. So any other questions? Or?
You would remove that 30% off of the anywhere other than the front or the back. Would there be?
Maybe you could say not in the last 20 feet or so. Because that's where the conflict is.
Right.
When you have somebody looking into somebody else's backyard. And the other thing is, if you really think of it, I mean, this is 4 feet. If I'm here or I'm there and you have a window, you're still going to be looking into the backyard. So maybe you just try to eliminate the windows, and that's what the architectural review committee does. And you work with the neighbors, I've never had a problem with it. So
I had a question for you. So one issue that gets identified with these FARs is, it's kind of flat, right? So it might be overly restrictive on a small lot,
right,
and too generous on a big lot.
Right.
Have you seen other formulations of FARs, where like maybe smaller lots, it's more generous, larger lots, less so?
One other thing you could consider, I guess, is limit the size of the second floor, which is like Atherton has that. So I forget what the numbers are, but I mean, they have huge setbacks there and no design review, but that could be a consideration also, I guess, to try to push to have more on the first floor. You could say 20% of it could be on the second floor, for instance, or
just do a percentage.
Just do it as a percentage. But I think somebody else is going to mention that if you have a lot that's 4,000 square feet and you only have a 50% FAR, you're going to end up with a 2,000 square foot house, and practically a one-car garage you think of as being 10 by 20, but that doesn't work because you can't even get the car doors open. So you need to have it 12 and a half or 13 feet wide. And then fires counted to the outside of the walls. So you lose a lot of space in there too. So, and a lot of these diagrams don't show backup space. Typically you need 25 foot of backup plus the garage. So you're going to be like 5 feet plus 20 feet or 21 feet plus 25 foot of backup if you have a wider garage. So most people don't want to have their garage in their rear yard. So I don't know if you have any other questions. Really appreciate all the effort.
Have either of the architects worked in communities that have form-based zoning, and if so, what was your experience?
Nobody else has it on the peninsula. So I guess they have it out in Walnut Creek or in Petaluma or something. But they might be bigger lots. I don't know what they have. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, John. Next is Linda Burrows.
Good evening. Thank you all, staff and commissioners, for all the time and effort. As a resident of San Carlos, I'm really very encouraged to see how far we've come in comprehensively looking at maintaining the reality that we are a city of good living as opposed to a city of supersized houses. I believe personally that the 50% FAR is something we need to give serious consideration. I think setbacks on the side of the house have strong value, as well as the front setback and the rear setback. Privacy and lighting are real, and I'm 5'6", and so if it's only 5 feet, you can't even get your ladder to clean the windows if that's all the space you've got between homes. It does seem extremely restrictive in my unprofessional view. I feel that the daylight plane is also a legitimate concern to spin on for a bit. Being in shadow is something that others have spoken on, and my new friend in the back made reference to a friend of hers who had a house supersized on either side, and now her solar panels no longer work because she doesn't get enough sun for them to work. So that is interesting. With regard to garages, I'd never given a lot of thought to garages in the front of the house being the super eyesore, Americans being so in love with their cars and so on. However, a garage being in the back has always concerned me about it being an accessory dwelling unit later on, which I think was made reference to by a couple of other people in terms of, again, privacy and so on. And I don't know what kind of guidelines we have for accessory dwelling units. It's pretty loose right now. I think it's just whatever the state says. I think that as we look at all of this very comprehensively, that might be something to give some strong consideration moving forward. So I just would say the 50-50 sounds good to me as a beginning, but we've gone so far and invested so much time right now that I think we need to really look very comprehensively at what we want restrictions to be going forward and guidelines. I kind of like the idea of the larger the house, the more opportunity for review. That's just me. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. And now another Linda, Ferrara.
Hi. I want to thank you guys too. I'm sorry I missed the first hour. I had another commitment. Been to many of these meetings over the last, I don't know how long, but I just wanted to thank you all for the option 3. That's good progress. I too am in favor of the 50% bar and the option 3. I just wanted to echo some of the other people's comments in that I'm here as just a citizen. I don't have a house construction project underway or in the future planned, and I fortunately don't have one going on next to me. And but I'm extremely concerned about this, and I want to just remind everyone that, at least in my opinion, the city of I just totally lost my whole train of thought. The City of Good Living, the San Carlos that we all moved here for, to me is not the picture of the big house, was a little house and became the big house. It's not those houses plastered next to each other, which to me is reminiscent of South San Francisco when you drive down 280 and has all of those houses just smashed together like condos with no land in between them. And to me, that is where we were headed with the original plans that were proposed, with the 3-foot setbacks maximum on the sides of the houses. And to me, that is not what the City of Good Living is, where the house fills up the entire lot from front to back and side to side. To me, it is houses that have yards around them. And, you know, I hear people telling me, well, that's not what the millennials want. Well, if that's not what they want, then let them go to some other city where the houses are all smashed up together, like South San Francisco. San Carlos is historically been where the houses have yards around them and where people can have their kids play in the yards or have a barbecue or whatever, where you can enjoy the outside, where we have decent weather around here. And the part of the enjoyment of owning a home is to be able to go outside and to enjoy your yard as well. And having a 3-foot setback, as the lady Linda just said, even with a 5-foot setback, you still can't do anything with a 5-foot setback. One of the previous architects said, well, you'd put plants in there so that you don't have to see your neighbors. So, well, anybody knows a plant gets 3 feet, 4 feet wide. So then you have no setback at all. So I want, and as far as the garages being in the back of the house, or even a 1-car garage, that's another one of my pet peeves. Because then the parking, if it's a 1-car garage, the parking is forced onto the streets. And we heard talking here at one of the meetings about, well, maybe we'll have to get permit parking. Come on. There's already such limited parking, and as soon as all those apartments that get filled up and all the other construction that's going on, there's going to be no parking on city streets. So forcing people to leave their perimeters of their property to park on public streets more than they're already doing is just going to make this place more of a friggin' nightmare than it already is. And I know that you guys referenced the survey that the city took about the parking. And yes, the parking survey turned out rosy because the way the questions were phrased. I got one of those surveys and I filled it out, and I had to sit and think about every single one of those questions. How am I going to answer this question? Because the way they phrased it, I have to put something that sounds really great down there. Does it seem more congested to you on the traffic on the roads? Well, it depends on what time of day you're talking about. If you're talking about the middle of the day, no, it's great. If you're talking about rush hour, no, it absolutely sucks. So, but the questions weren't asked in that manner. The questions were phrased to get a favorable response so that the data could come out smelling great. So, you know, it's those kind of things that drive people like me crazy, because I want to give an honest answer, but you got to shade it the way the questions were shaded. So, you know, what does that have to do with today? Well, it's all about parking on the street, and it's to do with the garages and where you place the garages. And like in one of the proposals, the garage was right back against the fence. And I heard it said that, oh yeah, then you could put the in-law unit on top of it. And oh no, that won't count as square footage. And I could just see this poor person who's been in their house behind that fence, and they've been there for 20 years or whatever, and they built their beautiful backyard, and they have their nice house, and here comes this garage with an in-law unit on the back with windows, and they're all looking down into their yard, and there goes their enjoyment of their yard. They can never go in their backyard again. That's not right. So, you know, when we sit around thinking of these grand ideas for maximizing the new person to come in and get all of their wants and needs met, what about the person who's been there for 20 years? It's not right. You've got to think of that stuff. So anyway, that's it for me for today. But I really am happy with the way things are now turning and going, that it seems like we're coming back to a little more logical way of doing it, more in the San Carlos way. And I hope that we keep going in this direction and make the houses more in the old, you know, like what was done before, what was it, 2009, when the planning standards went nuts and allowed these crazy big houses to get built. So thank you very much for your time and for your energy, and I hope that we get a little more into this before we take it to the, you know, done stamp. Thank you.
Thank you. One more I have. If anybody else wants to bring their slip up, you'll be after Peter Hartrell.
Thank you very much to all of you and your hard work. I think just a couple quick points. I think first is the perspective, as I think Christian said and several others, the perspective of our current standards or current rules versus those before 2011 versus those in our neighborhood communities. I think we need to be clear on what is our point of reference as we think about the changes. It was interesting, Al, to hear you, or maybe it was you, Stefan, referred to the 35% reduction. But I think we're in this meeting right now because we realize that our standards right now aren't right for this community. And I think it's worth looking instead at it from the perspective of the neighborhood communities, which is what the tables are trying to do. But we really need to be rigorous on the statistics we use in that comparison. I think second, I'd just like to say thank you to Stefan, who's put a lot of work into this, and the staff and you all, but also Good Growth San Carlos. I want to have a shout out to the work they've done over the last 2 years and the participants in the SHAC group. This is a lot of human resources have gone into this, and I'm looking forward to getting it wrapped up in a good way. And I feel like tonight is the beginning of seeing that endpoint. What we didn't talk about tonight, and has come up a couple times in some of these previous meetings, is some of the process that goes around whatever standard we come up with. And there's been talk about the distance of review, that if a house is changing, what is the line we draw, 300 feet or 500 feet or whatever, and that's been lost tonight, but I hope it's still in whatever standards come up, that gets expanded. So there's more of an opportunity for the neighbors to know what's happening and be engaged in the process. And then I think getting a professional architect on that review board was another idea. I think that makes sense, and we should not lose sight of those as we move forward. If asked, I would say I prefer number 3. I think number 3, I think the 50% or thereabouts far makes sense. I think encouraging single level homes in some manner it would be nice to see there as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to speak? Any questions?
I move we close public hearing.
It's been moved. We close the public hearing. Second. Roll.
Commissioner Dugan?
Yes.
Commissioner Jacoponi?
Yes.
Commissioner Roof?
Yes.
Vice Chair Bergman?
Yes.
And Chair Bradley?
Yes.
And through the chair, can we take a 5-minute recess? before we start our discussion? Either way, I'm going to take a 5-minute recess.
Yes, let's have a 5-minute recess. It's 9:05. We'll start back at 9:10.
Also wanted to declare communication with the Goodwill San Carlos group, just for the record.
So you'll just mention when we get back. Usually when I do it, I say put this vote in for this one. Either way, but I don't think we're going to vote on this. It's always a good idea to mention.
Good.
I declare the meeting resumed. Comments, questions?
So we're going to go into discussion?
Yes.
Okay.
Discussion.
So before we start discussion, I'd like to disclose some ex parte communication. In regards to this matter, I've talked to Una Kinsella, architect, John Stewart, architect David Clark, architect Bonnie McClure, who's been our RDRC guru for many, many, many years. The Good Growth, people from Good Growth, thank you very, very much for your input. And of course, our planning division and our consultant, Stefan. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I had communication with all those people. Okay.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I would just report I've had outside communication with the Good Growth for San Carlos, Christian and Brent.
I would also share that I had the opportunity to listen to the Good Growth San Carlos representatives, Christian and Brent, and I got to hear their perspectives firsthand, and thank you for taking the time to do that.
And I would also like to disclose communication with the Good Growth people. Thank you, as well as the planning department. And,
Thank you for that. And discussion?
I would just dive in on maybe a threshold issue before we get into more of the meatier parts, and that would just be lot coverage. It seems like the 40% rollback to the 2011 standard kind of carries through all of the options here. And the more I've kind of thought about that, and I'm interested in the other commissioners' reactions, I find that counterintuitive. I think by reducing lot coverage, I think we might be incentivizing second floor development, which I think is now what we want to do here. So my mind right now, and I want to get other input, is that we don't disrupt the current lot coverage and that we keep it at 50% with the thought of encouraging or maintaining the existing incentives to keep massing off the second floor.
I share that perspective. I think making a tighter lot size restriction would push building upwards, which is what annoys people the most.
Yeah, I don't think it's the garage face as much as it is the second story that tends to aggravate people. My only concern would be in other areas of town, but when we were showing the map, most of the other areas of town with the larger lots are part of the hillside overlay, so I don't think we're going to be infringing upon them, putting unruly restrictions on them, and it would apply more for where it needs to apply to. So I would support that.
And John, yeah, thanks for raising. It struck me the same way. I think Al used the idea of a balloon. Let's be real careful how we're squishing it, and if we're trying to incentivize low, let's allow it to spread out or not pull it back in. So unless staff have got comments as to something that we're really missing, I would not be encouraged going below the 50%.
No issue.
Thank you.
I'd just like to, all through this thing, the words that keep going through my head, Occam's razor, Occam's razor, Occam's razor, right, which is the simplest solution is usually the best solution. And I am very grateful and thankful for all the work of the staff and all the work of Stefan and his company to help us and have us look at the form-based codes, but I think it makes it more complicated than it needs to be. And so I personally support an FAR and a lot coverage combination. The other thing that I feel strongly about is not creating a situation where we're putting more cars on the roads. on the street parking. So that's the other thing is I don't want to put anything in place that would make street parking even more difficult. So I don't know how we discussed that or not, but that's something that is important to me. The sunlight or the daylight plane, I think it's worth discussing. I don't know what the solution is to that one though. So I think it's worth discussing between us, but I don't know what, if anything, we can do on that. But those are the areas that concern me the most.
Regarding the daylight plane, my inclination is not to have that because the setbacks effectively enforce that at the outer portions of the house, but it allows a little bit more flexibility towards the center for a diversity of architectural approaches. So a Tudor-style roof, perhaps, or a dormers. Otherwise, there's a strong, the restriction would strongly promote a more uniform look to the roof line, which perhaps some people would prefer, but I think allowing the diversity would be my preference.
I wonder if it's possible to give, because traditionally, at least since I've been here, the RDRC has really not had teeth. Right, but if there was a way to give the RDRC teeth to allow them to work with, allow them to work with, where that 30 feet is allowed, or whatever it is, if it's a concern of a neighbor, I'd feel a lot better, and I think that might solve it. Now, one would hope that would not have to be mitigated at that level, and that the planning division and the homeowner and the other homeowner would talk, but at the worst case, it could be mitigated there. But that would make me feel a lot better if there would be some way we could give the RDRC that power to work with that plane on the side, so it doesn't necessarily shut out someone's light. I know that's an idea.
I think that's great, and what's I guess not clear is how the 9-foot second-story setback plays into the option. It's currently code today, isn't that right?
That's correct.
And your point, I think the point you've raised a couple of times is with that 9-foot setback on the second story, you can't, it's very hard to create a structure that does not all automatically comply with a daylight plane proposal without having a separate piece of code. Is that, I think that's what you were saying.
Yes.
And maybe the question is does that work, Shannon? In your perspective, do you?
It does for the most part. I mean, the only thing that I'm thinking about is that extra 30% of the house that does not have to comply to the 9-foot setback. So that part can cast a shadow. So I was trying to figure out a way to help mitigate that potential, because it already has affected people. And but I don't feel comfortable specifying a 9-foot setback all the way down the house, because I think it creates another set of problems architecturally. So that's why I was suggesting the other. I mean, to me, it's not a showstopper to me, but I think it's important for a lot of people, and so I want to give it due consideration. So if you guys have better ideas, I definitely want to hear them. And I don't know, is that possible to grant that kind of power to the RDRC?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could do that. We can mull it over and come up with some.
All right, I think I've talked enough now.
Well, regarding the RDRC oversight, if there's an entirely objective FAR standard, what would trigger the RDRC having a review and anything to say?
So currently it's a square footage. I believe it's 3,000 square feet and or a 0.4 FAR. So, you know, we could leave it at that, or you could come up with a number, and anything over 2,000 or 2,500 square feet triggers RDRC review. But the current standard is, as I noted.
Yeah. I would also be interested to have the RDRC have the oversight of the daylight plane impingement and the position of elements along the side of the house, like Shannon was suggesting. And I wonder if we can have it specifically that the RDRC is allowed to enforce a compatibility with the neighborhood context. It's somewhat subjective, but at least if it's written into the rules that the RDRC can weigh in that realm, then it would be give them a little bit more room for negotiation and to ask for accommodations.
I think it's pretty straightforward to do that for the RDRC to be able to weigh in on neighbor compatibility. I guess in starting to think about this 30% of the side, the question would be, and we can either go back or get some more direction on it, is any time you have that 30%, does it trigger RDRC no matter what? And is that something you're interested in? Or something else? But that's what I'm thinking of at this point. Because there may be some cases where you're below the FAR and you conform to everything except you want that 30% because the first floor is there. And then should that trigger RDRC? That may be a pretty low threshold because people, it's a much harder process to go through. On the other hand, if the intent is to get more people engaged in the discussion, that may be a trigger. When you have that 30%, it goes or not. So that's something to think about.
What about if you had, you have to do neighborhood outreach, right?
Yes.
And if you had the neighbor basically raise an objection about that, then that would trigger it. Is that a possibility?
Well, that would already be assuming you're going through RDRC. You don't do neighborhood notification unless you go through RDRC at this point, yeah.
I guess we need to think about that.
Yeah, I would like to see the 30% trigger the RDRC oversight as an option for us to consider.
Anytime there's 30%,
because that 30% could be placed in a very obnoxious position relative to the neighbor.
Yeah.
So it's
well, should it be like anything over 25%, or does 29% not trigger it?
Keeping it simple. If you're going to be exceeding the straight setback, then why not have the RDRC look at it?
Well, if you're using any of it, okay.
And this is kind of from the perspective that the FAR, even if we crank it all the way down to 0.5, is not going to solve every issue for every house and neighbor. And so having a little bit of judgment brought to bear, I think would be useful.
So we talked about the 50% lot coverage. I think that leaves outstanding the FAR and where we want to go or what we think is reasonable for that. I'm really torn on that one. Right? I mean, I've heard a lot of people say 50-50. I don't know what the right number is, right? I don't want to just accept what people, not that I don't trust what people say, but how I don't understand the material changes going from 50 to 59 makes. I don't know what difference that really does. I don't have a picture in my head. Maybe that could be something that we can get from staff or something like that, because as part of what they bring back to us. Because I'd like to. I don't have a concept of what that will do.
I agree with that completely. If we end up on an option 3, it seems to me there, an awful lot of good, creative, sophisticated thought went into this form-based standard, and so I do think we should pause and fully address whether we're completely moving away from that or not, or if the sliding scale can invoke that on our largest projects. So I think we should have that discussion. But with regard to just the floor area ratio, it just seems like, all the sophistication and thinking that went into the form base, there must be other creative ideas than just a flat FAR number. And by that I mean, we seem to have a concern that 50% might be too small for one of our 4,000 square foot lots, because that only, minus a garage, allows 1,700 feet or so, very small. But yet 50% of a 10,000 foot lot, that's a big house. Maybe people don't like that. So just, in a complete vacuum, it just occurred to me, what about like a 0.6 FAR up to your first 5,000 feet, and then after that it's a 0.3 FAR or something like that. And that, I'm just saying, it seems like there could be a lot of different ways to meet our objective, which is stop really large, bulky houses that people don't like, but yet not restrict someone who happens to own a small lot from being able to meet the needs of their family. So as we talk about FAR, I guess I would want to ask staff to go and think through or research the various options that have been implemented elsewhere to solve that problem of how to be more generous with smaller lots and perhaps less generous with larger lots.
Yeah, I agree.
That's actually a real good point.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
But at the same time, then, if you do that, you're going to perhaps encourage people to build larger houses on the smaller lots. It works against us, too.
Yeah, I see that it's the balloon thing. Every time you push one side of the balloon, I think, who mentioned that earlier this evening, but it is the balloon thing. I mean, the thing that pops into my head is, what are we not thinking about? What are the impacts are we not thinking about? I mean, we're listening to the community, and I know we need to make changes, but what are we not thinking about? I don't know. I don't have that answer. I'd almost ask like Al to ask us what we're not thinking about, because I don't know enough to know the kind of things that could be bite us in the rear. And 18 months from now, there's a whole new set of people come in with a whole new set of complaints because we made this change, and I don't want that to happen, right? I want us to make good decisions, and anyway, enough said.
I think everyone that's here out in the audience tonight, I know you knew this before, but you certainly know it at 9:30 this evening, that planning is complicated, it's controversial, and it requires compromises. And we're sitting up here because we want to serve the city of good living. We have an excellent planning staff and consultant here involved in this. They have put in nearly a year, maybe more at this point now, on coming up with this, and it is complicated. But our main task is always to look at the public interest. What is best for the most people for the longest amount of time, and what will hurt the fewest number of people, and perhaps for the shortest amount of time. And it's not an easy answer to come up with. My inclination is to do the simplest thing and arrive at a number for FAR and lot coverage, but it requires more complexity than that, more vision perhaps, and we may not know. There are not that many towns, if we use form-based, there are not that many cities around using it, as was pointed out earlier, none on the peninsula. That doesn't mean it's wrong or good or bad either way necessarily, but it is more complicated.
Maybe that's the best next thing for us to do, is just to consider the form-based approach and whether we want that part of our solution or not at all. I hesitate, I'm relatively new on the commission, I think 2 months or so. And I was struck by the fact that the SHAC started meeting in February 2017 and has put so much time and effort, as well as staff and Stefan. So, I do hesitate to wade in now and just say, it's too complicated. Let's completely leave all that work behind. I will say that I don't think we're there yet. I'm open to the general idea of a more sophisticated approach that would meet our objective of reducing overly massed houses in San Carlos. And form-based, if it did provide more flexibility and a better solution in a more sophisticated, elegant way than just a FAR, I could be supportive of that. But I am struck. I've spent some time over the past week just listening and writing down all the different concerns I've heard, and I've been struck by the fact that nearly everyone involved has said, boy, this thing is complicated as heck, will be expensive and difficult to implement, and boy, there's probably a lot of unintended consequences we're not even thinking of. And I'm also struck by, we haven't heard a single comment, I don't believe, in support of a form-based approach. And maybe that's because this is so new or untried that no one is familiar with this yet. But it does cause me to pause. And then if it's worthwhile, I could go into, I've got kind of about 10 bullet points of specific concerns about whether we would need to study parking, if it really impacts parking. How exactly does it apply to remodels? Does it interrupt the ability to do those great rooms that everyone tends to want? Is an 18-foot wing large enough for an adequate garage if we're kind of wrestling people into thinking of their garage as a wing now? How does it relate to the accessory dwelling unit? So again, I just have chronicled a long list of things that I feel like if we did stay with a form-based approach, I would want to make sure I was more comfortable and had more answers to some of these areas of concern before I wanted to move on. So that kind of personally leaves me with two options: either move past the forms-based approach at this time and then move on to an option 3, or take more time, probably have at least one more study session and really dig into these issues. And so I guess I would just want to hear from the other commissioners where you're at as far as considering the viability of a forms-based approach.
Yeah, great summary, and maybe before tackling that specific, for me, of the 3 proposals that staff put together, the one that I'm least in favor of is the number 2 with the sliding scale. It seems to me to not have either the simplicity of the FAR, or you use sophistication of the form-based. It kind of fits in the middle. It seems to throw a lot of stuff over the wall into the RDRC, and it doesn't strike me as bringing clarity, simplicity, and the kind of things that we're looking for. So personally, it doesn't strike me as a good option. I'd take it off the table. And then, I like personally the simplicity of FAR, and it seems to miss it seems to be at risk of leaving some good work on the table. And I guess the simple question I'd ask staff for the next time we get together is, so what would the marriage of 1 and 3 look like? So what are the, if you took form-based and you put a cap on it, or if that cap had a threshold of automatically going to RDRC, what would that result in? And vice versa, if we ended up just using a FAR, what would your biggest regrets be? Actually, maybe you could speak to that tonight. What would your biggest regrets be of what you've learned in this journey over the past 12 months? And therefore, what would our regret on that side be? So from my perspective, I'm with you. I'm not ready to say, let's go simple. The complexity of form-based feels bold and maybe a bridge too far at this time, but I'm not yet ready to walk away from it. So maybe, Al, do you have a thought or two on what are the learnings over the past 12 months or so that you would say would be the biggest regrets from leaving form-based at this time and just going to a FAR?
Well, I think that there's a few things about the form-based is it forces the actual form of the building into a smaller box, and thus when people walk down the street or when people are looking in their backyards, they would see a smaller house. Simple as that. Just the box gets smaller with form-based codes, and you can move it around. It provides flexibility. So I'm not sure it's a regret. I just think that maybe you're right. Maybe it's just we're not ready for that. But I think it's a very, very effective tool. However, and then to go to one of your other questions, I think if you added FAR to number 1, you'd end up at number 2. So, and you didn't like, you aren't in favor of that one. So I'm not sure that that's really, you know, I think that if you're going to kind of meld some of these ideas, it would be additional setbacks at the rear, maybe at the top of the building in the front. We suggested moving the top back a foot, the rear, we suggested moving the rear in. So those are some of the things, I think, just trying to get that box smaller, and in addition to the square footage. Those are, I think that's all I would add. And again, height, I think, is an issue. We talked about limiting some of the height on the first and second floor, the eaves. I think that's important. Some of the numerical standards that are pretty easy, the things that we were suggesting for the hillside overlay. You want to add something to that?
A good way to think about this is, and the house actually that Christian Vesha showed tonight, which has been the topic of a lot of these meetings, and I agree with John, who mentioned that it actually is quite a beautiful house, but it does raise a lot of issues. One thing to think about is that that house has a much smaller second floor than the first floor. So the majority of the square footage of the house is on the first story. It is ostensibly complying with a daylight plane standard. As we showed, it has a very high FAR, 0.62, but we could achieve the same house from the street could be achieved with a 0.5 FAR. And that sort of dilemma is what caused us to start to pursue these sort of form-based standards, is that FAR in and of itself, it helps to mitigate some of these issues, but it won't make it go away.
But if you balance out with lot coverage, then you...
The lot coverage on that house is definitely under 50%, and I think it's 40, it's not that high, because the lot actually is fairly large. So I couldn't say if you allowed a larger, if you allowed it to go to 50%, you might get a larger first floor than second floor, but it wouldn't be enough to make the second floor go away entirely. I mean, that definitely could be studied as an option, but some of these other things that we found that contribute to quote-unquote house size, I think are resting in this form-based option, and that's why I think we personally have struggled to sort of to say, you know what, this is a simple problem that can be addressed only with an FAR. But I think if you do have additional discussion about this, that house is sort of a great example of the sort of complexity of the issue I think that you are confronting.
Well, given that, let me just ask, so what that house obviously violated was the RDRC criteria of a design compatible with neighboring development and avoiding big differences in building scale and character. And I'm just, so why does our RDRC process not work? I mean, what's broken there? What, you know, Shannon, you serve on that committee and you mentioned it has no teeth. I mean, so is that the problem we have here?
Well, for one thing, whenever you're faced with subjective standards versus objective standards always outweigh it. So we had something come in front of us, and actually it was the thing that started this whole thing, and where there was a two-story house that was built next to a one-story house, and it ended up blocking views, and it was really sort of it was a very sad situation. And we took it all the way to the city attorney, and I said, do I have a right to say this doesn't fit the form and character when it fits within the numerical means of what's in there? And we were told that we had to follow what the law was, which was that it was the objective standards stood more so than the subjective standards. So we ended up approving a project that we absolutely hated and didn't want to approve because we were faced with numeric versus subjective standards, and that's where it fell. In my opinion, that's where it falls down.
That makes sense, but I mean, there's a lot of communities that drive the subjective standards. So are we unique in that area where we default to a legal opinion on subjectivity versus objectivity? I mean, because lots of communities drive subjective stuff very hard.
If I could try on that one. Yeah, I mean, I've served design review boards. I've been on design review boards for single-family houses and other communities. And it depends on who's sitting across the table from the architect that's making the presentation, a lot of it. Part of it. And so, and part of it is to give the RDRC something that is a little bit more objective and less, less so. And so we are going to come forward with something that will help people serving on the RDRC know where their bounds are. We'll work with the city attorney on that. He's taken a conservative approach, and we can work with him on that. And I think getting an architect and getting 2 design professionals on the RDRC is going to make a big difference. So I think we're on the way, and the council's already approved that change in in the way we do business. Is they said you got to have 2 designers. One's got to be a professional architect. The other has to have design experience out of the 3. So I think we're on our way there, and we will come back to the Planning Commission and Council with better design guidelines and more robust and things that and more directive for the RDRC to understand what their purview is. But not as part of this project tonight.
Understood.
Well, my opinion about the FAR is that it is a simple solution and would be good a lot of the time, but the trouble is that it solves principally the neighbor issues that go on from the house, and it doesn't solve the street view, and this is the point that Stefan just made. And I'm a little concerned that if we go forward with something that doesn't solve the street view thing for the whole population of San Carlos, we're not meeting the needs of the town. And so I don't know that I see an easy way to implement the form-based solution, but maybe we do need to keep talking about that. And then the garages issue, the point's been made that requiring a two-car garage on narrow lots forces a very garagey look, which is the street view perspective, and balancing that, the negative aspect of that versus the negative aspects of the parking, to the extent that garages help with parking, because we all know that people don't park their car in the garage very much, but and so reviving the idea of allowing a single car garage on narrow lots might be one step towards improving the street experience in the right circumstances. So I'd love to see that point as an option for us to consider.
Oh, feels like we're going in circles. I guess it's because there's really no easy answer.
Yeah, it doesn't seem to be an easy answer. You know, one of the things that the community has, so our meetings together as newer commissioners, community has been clear that the size of the home allowed on lots today is too big. And what's not clear is how the form-based approach really limits in let's say 25% of the cases that outcome. So it would seem if form-based to address adjacencies, but also address street view, along with a way to say, over this size house just is not going to work on these size lots. Maybe that's the fine line that we'd like to walk, and it's not exactly clear how to do that. So from my perspective, any way to really speak to the point, okay, we're coming down 35%, but we're coming down 35% from what's 0.89 today, it feels like that's okay. So how could you suggest, I guess the question I'd leave you with is, how can we address both? The community's voice about limiting the size as well as in addition to the way it looks.
And so through the chair, I think I would suggest that what we're hearing, and I think what we've heard, is that there's a general consensus that FAR is a tool that is clear, understandable, it's something that it has some support. So we would recommend that you move forward with that and you come to terms on, maybe we come with a sliding scale. We'll come with 2 or 3 options for you at the next meeting, written in an ordinance. I think if you are still interested in the form-based approach, we could come with some guidelines later, and we could use the form-based ideas in design guidelines for use by the RDRC. And so we could take some of these concepts, have more time to flesh them out later, but I don't see that happening within the time period that, we're running out of, resources to complete this project. If we don't complete it soon, we will have to go back and kind of regroup and ask for more resources to complete it. So I think to kind of get it out in front of the issue and the problem today, I've heard a couple of things. I've heard that there is some consensus around FAR. There's been a suggestion on the table to look at smaller lots allowing for a 1-car garage. 2 cars may be required, but a 1-car garage. So those are a couple of statements that I've heard, and a 50% lot coverage. So those are the 3 sort of zoning code standards that there may be consensus on, and perhaps if would the chair be interested in maybe taking a poll to see if there's support on those 3 issues, on the lot coverage at 50%, some kind of an FAR, whether it be a singular number or a sliding scale, and the parking. Maybe those are 3 areas where you could look at each one, see if there's consensus on each one of those.
What was the parking that you were suggesting?
Yeah, it was suggested that because on narrow lots, it's more difficult to provide that wide 2-car garage, and it takes up a lot of the frontage. On smaller lots, maybe on lots less than 40 feet or 50 feet wide, we allow for a single car garage, but a 2-car requirement. So you'd have to have at least one in the driveway of sufficient length and then one in the garage. So you'd still make the 2 cars on site, but you'd only have to have one covered.
And I'm sorry, would that be prescribed, or they just have the option to do that?
It would be an option. Okay. And again, only on the narrowest of lots we're talking, and that would be something to consider. I know on a 40-foot wide lot, very, very difficult. You're looking at 20 feet, right there for a 2-car. Yeah. So it's almost impossible, I've heard from people trying to do it. So it may be that we look at maybe 50 as the cutoff, 50, and we'll bring that back to you. And then go from there. We'll take a look at that, maybe come back with some diagrams or something.
On the parking, I would just want to understand how many parking spaces we would lose. Like, if it's 40 foot, I think you've done the calculation of how many 40-foot lots are in the city. And, I guess it's just for new projects, so maybe it's not all of them, but, we're definitely giving up parking spaces. My concern isn't the size of the garage, it's whether you can pull 2 cars into a driveway or not is kind of my concern. Because I think if we restrict it to a 1-car driveway, we are pushing 1 car out into the street per house designed that way.
So we would then say that you could do a 2-car wide garage, driveway. Yeah, so we would add that. But you wouldn't lose any parking. I mean, you're right that practically people don't use their garage a lot of times. So we would just prescribe that, saying that, yes, you could have a 2-car wide driveway, which I don't think we do now for real narrow lots. Oh, we do? We do? Okay, we already allow that. But we could be more descriptive about that.
No, I like what you're saying, Al. I think let's start, we can put some tent pegs or nails down on some of the things we can agree with, and then have you come back with some options on the things that were still up in the air. A couple of things that haven't been discussed, but I just wanted to say, I don't think I don't support any more neighborhood zoning. I did at one point. I do support the hillside overlay change from 6 feet to 3 feet. I don't know how everyone else feels, but, and then one thing I wanted to mention is whatever we do, whatever we decide, I think that after the first 5 houses are built, that we have a public hearing or some kind of hearing where we get the feedback from the neighborhood, at least, or I don't know if it has to be public or not, but we need to evaluate it, what we've done. And then say, do we like this? Do we not like this? Do we want to change it a little bit? And then either keep it the way it is or make recommendations to get into the city council. But I think whatever we come up with, after I pick a number of houses, but I just arbitrarily pick 5, that we review it. So we're not locked in so much that we can't make some small changes and tweaks after we've seen what's happened. So anyway, with that.
Does anyone want to articulate that into a motion? For direction for the
Well, I just give it to them as direction as long as you guys are okay with it.
Yeah, with regard to the hillside overlay proposal, as described, it seems to make sense, and I would support it as you proposed. That meaning, again, the things that were in the materials that you provided in advance.
I also support the hillside overlay proposal, and I like the FAR with a sliding scale, partly because I'm concerned about the larger lots, it not being sufficiently restrictive. San Carlos would be an outlier for larger lots if we went with 0.5. The other elements that you were asking about the straw poll on, remind me, there was the lot coverage of 50%. Definitely endorse that idea.
So are you saying 50-50? 50 FAR, 50 on lot coverage?
I think the FAR should be a sliding scale because 50 is too much for large lots, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that like I said, I don't know what that one looks like and one doesn't. So I think that if you guys could come back with, that'd be good.
So the question is for the commission, sliding scale, is there consensus that you want us to come back with some suggestions for a sliding scale, FAR, or a number? I've heard a couple of people in support of a sliding scale.
My guidance on that would be, we've put all this time and effort into studying this sophisticated forms-based approach, and then we're just kind of picking, a number or thinking about, I would like to not launch a major effort, but at least a minor study effort on how can we be creative with the FAR, whether it's a sliding scale. It also occurred to me maybe we could exclude partial garage or exclude porches or exclude ADUs from it. There's a myriad of ways that a FAR could be sliced to meet our needs in a more sophisticated way, which I think I would define as being somewhat more generous with smaller houses and making sure the larger lots are properly contained. But then, I think it is worth considering that it can be a tool of incentive. Do we want to incentivize ADUs? Do we want to incentivize porches? Or, is there anything else we would want to incentivize with a FAR standard?
Okay. So sliding scale, though, you're okay with that? I think there's general consensus, sliding scale with some options.
I would look at that. I haven't landed on whether I'm okay with sliding scale as a final solution, but I definitely want to see what that would look like.
Okay.
And just to be clear, the option that you proposed about a sliding in the pack, the sliding scale, had different thresholds of RDRC engagement. I think that may be, but to respond to your point, the idea of different lot sizes having a different FAR, if that's what you mean by sliding scale, actually that makes sense, and I'm also in the same place.
That's what I mean by sliding scale.
Yes.
And the confusion is that you've labeled option 2 as an FAR sliding scale, and that's a different slide entirely, and that's according that different triggers for different sets of standards, which I thought was a creative approach. It gets complicated, but that's different than just having the FAR.
Only the FAR is what
ratioed to the lot size in some way is.
Okay. I think so. Only FAR, not attached to these other issues. Yes. All right.
Yeah.
So what we're hearing is Hillside. There's general consensus for the Hillside changes.
I had just one quick question on that, because the Hillside also involves, I believe, reducing the max height. And when you reduce the max height, are there prescriptions on the angle allowed on the roof, or when you reduce max height, are you just flattening the roof, or are you also forcing them to give up ceiling height in the living space?
It's just the eave, yeah. So it's not the roof form, it's just the wall, the straight part of the wall that goes up.
Okay.
Would get, prescribed a number. Right now, it allows you to kind of, for one story, you could do a huge 20-plus foot high one story, and then another story above that. So it really kind of forces you down into 2 reasonable ceiling heights. You could still get a 9-foot ceiling or a 10-foot ceiling in there, but it just brings the height of that straight up wall down. Doesn't affect the roof form.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I support the Hillside overlay revisions.
Okay, and finally, the parking question. Is there consensus that there's openness to exploring a 1-car garage with a 2-car wide driveway? Not as a prescribed 2-car wide driveway, but just allowing for 2 cars and 1 car in a garage. Is there consensus for that?
I think it's
for narrow lots.
I don't think there's a better way to. I don't think you can force people to park in their driveway, but making it more likely, I think that's better. So I could get behind that, because it's not necessarily going to force cars on those streets. So, yeah.
Well, I support it. I think if you don't prescribe the 2-car wide driveway, I do think we're pushing parking out into the street. Maybe that's not a major issue in most places where there's narrow lots. I don't know.
Putting it in the street?
I think if we go from 2-car wide driveways to 1-car wide driveways, we are.
The other way.
No, they're saying allow it to be one, but or allow it to be 1 or 2, and so they could choose one, and then we would have shoved a car out.
No, I don't support that. Yeah. No,
Is the two options you're comparing are keep the 2-car but at the back and have a 1-car wide drive, or allow a 1-car closer to the street but have a 2-car wide driveway? Or am I missing that point?
No, that's correct. So on narrow lots, like 40-foot wide lots, it's very difficult to get a 2-car wide, garage and then have a door and have everything else. I mean, it's a problem in our community. So what this would be is on narrow lots, 40 or 50 foot wide, let's say you cut it off at 50 feet and less, you could do a 1-car garage. Right now, we say you have to have 2 covered spaces. You have to, no matter what, right? That's the code. Right now, you're just giving more flexibility. You're saying, well, we recognize it's really hard to do that, and you talk about form-based, it adds to the mass of the front of the house. It looks a lot more massive. So we will be okay with 1 car in the garage, and you're allowed to have 2 cars in the driveway, but it wouldn't per se you had to have 2 cars in the driveway.
Why wouldn't we want to just say you have to have a 2-car driveway?
We require 2 cars in the driveway, because that would
then you would be
address
requiring 3 cars on site in that.
That's more.
And that is more restrictive. Yeah, currently today, we only require 2 cars on site for any house.
Is that right? I mean, if you require 2 covered with the setback, that means there's a 2-car driveway there in front of that, right?
A lot of times, but on slope lots, you don't get that, because you have to put the garage closer to the street on slope lots a lot of times. So you eliminate the long enough driveway to get your car in.
I think for practical purposes, requiring a 2-car driveway and a 1-car garage is actually a loosening of the standard. I think for all practical purposes, and I would support that, because we're not, I would like to see it that way personally, just because otherwise I think we are shoving cars out into the streets.
So you're saying that anytime, if you do want a 1-car garage, you have to have a 2-car wide driveway. That's,
or at least long enough for 2 cars, I guess.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So it's tandem.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could support that.
Yeah, me too.
Okay. Very good.
Yeah, I like that too.
There's consensus. All right. I think those are the issues. We have parking, hillside, sliding scale with some options, in-lot coverage at 50%. Those were the 4 items, and it looks like we have consensus on all 4 of those. Is there any other?
Do you guys agree with having some kind of review after X amount of houses have been built?
I like the idea, but I'm somewhat skeptical about how that could be built into the zoning code recommendation that we're sending to the city council.
No, I don't know either, but
so that's
I think
it seems a little squishy somehow.
Well, I just think we would want to do that, and that's in our purview to do it. So I agree with you. Once this approves, we're going to want to listen to the community as we meet twice a month, right?
I mean, it doesn't have to be there, but I think, I don't know, is there a way to prescribe that?
I'm not sure you could prescribe it, no, but you could ask that, you could make that recommendation to the city council that in a year's time after adoption, and it would, it takes a while to design and build a house, so it might be a year and a half, 2 years, but after a certain amount of time that it be re-reviewed to see its effectiveness.
A re-review.
You can make that recommendation.
Okay. Are you guys okay with that?
If you can come up with a way to implement a re-review, I would support that.
Okay.
Yeah. And the only other thing, Al, I think there may be consensus on, Jim, you had voiced a concern, but in general, I like your option 2 sliding scale. It will need a new name, but the idea of if a homeowner is doing a simple small addition. It involves a lot less review. I mean, I like that idea. That's a good idea. Now, whether we want to maintain the forms-based hammer, I'll say, on the largest houses, that's an open question. But I think there might be consensus on a staged review where the small one, I guess up to a 50 FAR, is just processed by staff. I don't know. I like the idea of simplifying review if we're confident no more review will be needed because it's already a small scale addition.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe the thing that caught my eye was this between 0.6 and 0.7 FAR, and I'm already thinking, okay, we've got big houses, and that was kind of counter to where my head was, which was looking to reduce the size. So maybe just take my comments as simplicity would be better, and I actually don't like the idea of a 0.6 or 0.7 FAR in general.
Yeah, me either.
So maybe the consensus is just your first level on your option 2 is allowed as well, which means staff review of particularly small additions.
To incentivize the smaller houses.
Okay.
Right. Yeah.
And 1 story.
We already have a kind of a 2-stage
We do,
process
and
with
it's
the
a
3,000 square foot
FAR. Is that
0.4?
Right now, the trigger is a 0.4 FAR for a new home. Is that correct? Yeah, for a new home, that's the trigger right now for RDRC.
So that triggers RDRC, but it doesn't trigger a different set of standards that would be applied, and that's the innovative thing that you've got in your option 2.
Right.
And so if we wanted to keep this this kind of low threshold to bring it to the RDRC, and then a second threshold that would let you go to the RDRC, where you start forcing a or exchanging some additional square footage for some form-based approach, then that would be an option. I agree with you that the form-based approach, because it helps not only the neighbor experience, but it helps the street experience. I'm also sad to let it go. I'm not seeing an easy way to hold on to it.
So I think if we come up with that was the reason why I wanted to see what the other communities were doing with FAR and lot coverage, because I figure if we were somewhere in the middle of the pack, we couldn't be making too big of a swing one way or another, right? Because we'd be in line with sort of what our communities along the peninsula were doing. Because as we've figured out here, the one house that Stefan brought up, would have looked, we wouldn't have solved the problem with what we were proposing, right? So that concerns me, and that's one of the reasons why I wanted to say, well, let's find something simple in the middle. Otherwise, we're not going to, the 80-20 rule, right? Find something in the middle that is known in the community and that will work. So anyway, I'll leave it at that, and we'll see what the staff comes up with. And I just don't want to make it too complicated, because I don't think we buy anything by making it very complicated. I don't think we really accomplish anything. So.
And all this does away with the requirement of daylight plane work. Make that clear.
Yeah, with the reduction in height standards that I see kind of trickled through here, yes, because that's how staff's recommendation is relying upon increased second-story setbacks and reduced eave height to accomplish the same thing. And I think I'm confident in that. I don't know if there's anyone else who has a question on that, but I think I'm comfortable leaving that behind at this point.
Yeah, I am too.
Yeah, I am too.
Good. I think we have pretty clear direction, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
So the question, if you come back with this information, is it considered another planning session, or can we vote?
No, we're going to come back as a public hearing. So I think that you've provided some very clear direction to the staff. And so I think we can bring it to a public hearing. You can debate at a public hearing, and you can make changes, so that's okay. You've studied the issue, and I think you've come to a conclusion. And so I think you're done studying and ready to start deliberating on what you want in the ordinance. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, the next item is reports, correspondence, and general information from the staff.
I don't have anything.
Commission, any information or reports?
Thank you to staff for all the hard work.
Yes, and thank you for all the citizen input we received tonight. We do appreciate it. I have an announcement. I have this Saturday we'll start teaching a class for city planners at Cal Berkeley so they can help pass their certification examination, which is a national one, and none other than Al Savay, our community development director, also lectures to that class. He'll be on in November, and appreciate that. That's all I have. Anything else? Declare the meeting adjourned.